Go ahead and get comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little. Let the room go dark around you, and just let this wash over you. Because where we're going tonight doesn't require you to do anything except breathe and listen and let Springfield come to you slowly. We're going to spend a long time in Springfield tonight, long enough that by the time we're done, you'll have moved through every corner of the town, every cracked sidewalk and glowing river, every shadow behind the cooling towers, and every secret buried beneath the surface of a show that most people think they already understand. Most people think The Simpsons is a cartoon about a clumsy dad and his family. And on the surface, it is. But underneath that surface, underneath 36 years of yellow skin and four-fingered hands and children who never age and a billionaire who should have died a century ago, there are patterns. And those patterns, once you start to see them, never quite disappear. So, settle in. Close your eyes if you want to. You don't need to watch anything. Just listen to the story of Springfield and let it carry you somewhere far away and strangely familiar at the same time. We start at the beginning of everything, the thing that, once you understand it, explains almost everything else. Springfield has a nuclear power plant. You know this already. It's part of the show's visual grammar from the very first episode. Those two enormous cooling towers sitting at the edge of town, occasionally breathing steam into the sky, so familiar that the eye slides right past them. They're background furniture. They're the thing you stop noticing because they've always been there. But here's what happens when you stop sliding past them and actually look. The Springfield nuclear power plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is the primary source of electrical power for the entire town of Springfield. And according to everything the show has told us across 36 seasons, it is one of the most catastrophically unsafe industrial facilities that has ever existed, in fiction or otherwise. At some point during the show's run, the plant received a surprise safety inspection. The result of that inspection was the discovery of 342 separate safety violations. 342. The kind of number that doesn't sound real when you say it out loud. The estimated cost to bring the facility up to code, to fix those violations, to make the plant something that a reasonable person wouldn't be terrified to live near, was $56 million. The man who owned the plant refused to spend it. His name is Charles Montgomery Burns, and he is a billionaire many times over. The money was available. The decision not to spend it wasn't about poverty or ignorance. It was a deliberate choice, made by a man who understood exactly what those violations represented and decided that the inconvenience of fixing them was greater than the consequences of leaving them in place. What were those violations? The show gives us glimpses, and the glimpses are extraordinary in their casualness. Radioactive waste being discharged directly into bodies of water. Radioactive waste being deposited onto children's playgrounds. Plutonium, actual weapons-grade plutonium, sitting on a desk as a paperweight. Cooling towers with structural cracks sealed with chewing gum. Rats running through the plant's maintenance corridors that glow with a visible luminescence, lit from within by whatever they've absorbed from the facility around them. And then there's the one the show drops without ceremony and never revisits. Human skeletons in the basement of an active nuclear facility. The show shows you the bones. It shows you a safety inspector discovering them in a sub-level corridor. And then the scene moves on. Nobody asks who those people were. Nobody asks how they came to be skeletal remains in the basement of a working reactor. The information is offered to the viewer and then quietly withdrawn, like a hand extended and then pulled back before anyone can take it. That is how the plant's horror tends to operate throughout the series. Shown and then unseen. Acknowledged and then forgotten. The violations pile up in the background of the show's reality, and because they're delivered as jokes, because they arrive wrapped in the show's signature tone of cheerful absurdity, the audience laughs and moves on just like Springfield does. But we're not going to move on tonight. We're going to sit with it for a moment. 342 violations. Radioactive waste in playgrounds. Chewing gum holding together cooling towers that contain an active nuclear reaction. Glowing rats. Unexplained human remains. And standing between all of that and the outside world, the man whose literal job it is to ensure none of it reaches the people of Springfield is Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, who the show's own creator has stated, has an IQ of 55. Homer Simpson, who at one point during the series is discovered to have had a crayon lodged in his brain since early childhood, physically impeding his cognitive function in a measurable and significant way. Homer Simpson, who falls asleep at his safety monitoring console regularly enough that it's a recurring visual gag, Who eats donuts during meltdown warning alarms? Who, in one episode, caused a minor nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to test whether it would grow larger in the radiation field? That is the safety inspector. That is the man. And he has been doing this job, in that building, surrounded by those 342 violations, for the entirety of his adult life. Now here is where the theory that explains almost everything about Springfield begins to form. In Season 2 of the show, a fish is pulled from a river near the power plant. The fish has 3 eyes, not 2, 3. A third eye growing from the center of its forehead, fully formed, apparently functional. The fish is named Blinky, and it becomes a national story within the world of the show. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as campaign evidence, arguing publicly that Mr. Burns is poisoning Springfield's environment. Burns is forced, on live television, to eat the fish himself as a demonstration that it's harmless. He sits at a dinner table with cameras rolling. He cuts into the fish, he chews, and then the episode ends. The town watches, the town shrugs, the town moves on. Nobody tests the river water. Nobody conducts a follow-up investigation into what might be causing fish in Springfield's waterways to develop additional organs. Nobody, in the entire community of people who watch Blinky's story play out on the evening news, thinks to ask the obvious question. If the fish that live in the river have 3 eyes, what is happening to the people who drink from the same water supply? The answer to that question has been sitting in the show's DNA since the very beginning. It's in the yellow skin. It's in the bulging eyes that sit slightly too large for every face in Springfield. It's in the 4 fingers on every hand. It's in Homer's overbite and impossible skull shape and the hair that maintains its spiky architecture without product or effort. It's in Marge's tower of blue hair that defies gravity, holding its shape perfectly for 36 years without variation. The radiation theory is this. The Springfield nuclear power plant has been quietly contaminating the town and its residents for decades. The mutations are visible. They are observable. They manifest differently in different people, but they are consistent, systematic, and entirely explicable by the kind of prolonged exposure that would result from living near a facility with 342 active violations and no meaningful safety enforcement. Here's the detail that makes it click into place in a way you can't unsee. When guests visit Springfield, when characters who come from outside the town appear on screen, they look different. Not slightly different, not stylistically different, fundamentally different. Their eyes are normally proportioned. Their features sit on their faces the way features sit on actual human faces. Their hands have 5 fingers. They look like people. Springfield residents look like Springfield residents. The standard explanation for this is art style. The show has a distinctive visual vocabulary, and guest characters are sometimes drawn with more realistic proportions as a kind of comedic contrast. That's the surface reading, the one the show would prefer you to accept. But the theory invites you to look at it from inside the show's own logic. Within the world of Springfield, there is a visible, consistent, observable difference between people who live inside the town and people who come from outside it. The people inside the contamination zone display physical characteristics that don't exist in normal human populations. The people from outside it look like normal human beings. Even the animals are affected. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same proportional abnormalities as his owners. The same eyes, the same subtle wrongness in the geometry of his body. Blinky the fish grew an extra eye. The glowing rats in the plant's basement corridors are lit from within. The show tells you, directly and explicitly, through the 3-eyed fish, that the radiation is doing something to living organisms in Springfield. And then it presents you with an entire town of human beings who display physical abnormalities and asks you to accept that those abnormalities have nothing to do with the same source. And the man at the center of all of it, the man who owns the plant and has owned it for decades, knows. The show makes this clear across multiple episodes, in ways that are individually easy to brush past but collectively form something undeniable. Burns funds private medical research. He employs personal physicians. He has a pharmaceutical division attached to his corporate empire. And most tellingly, as we'll explore in detail later in this video, he undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. A treatment that keeps him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without it, he dies. Burns is personally dependent on managing the effects of radiation in his own body. He understands, at a biological and medical level, what prolonged exposure to nuclear material does to living systems, because he experiences those effects in himself every single week. And the nature of his continued employment of Homer Simpson is worth examining very carefully here. When the plant was briefly purchased by a group of German investors, one of their first decisions was to fire Homer Simpson. Immediately. The inspection found his performance catastrophic and his presence a liability. They then assessed what it would cost to bring the facility up to safety code. The estimate nearly bankrupted them. They sold the plant back to Burns. Burns bought it back and immediately, without hesitation, rehired Homer. A competent safety inspector would find those violations and shut the plant down. A competent safety inspector would file reports, would escalate, would trigger investigations that Burns cannot afford to have triggered. Homer Simpson does not do any of those things. He sleeps. He eats donuts. He loses track of important readouts. He functions, from Burns's perspective, not as a liability but as an asset, the best possible shield between a plant full of violations and the regulatory attention those violations would otherwise attract. Homer's continued employment isn't negligence on Burns's part. It's policy. And there's a deeper layer to this that the show surfaces in Season 12, in an episode that begins as a joke and slowly becomes something much stranger. In that episode, it's revealed that Homer once had the crayon removed from his brain, and something extraordinary happened. His IQ climbed dramatically. He became intelligent, articulate, capable of understanding the world around him in ways he had never been able to before. He could read complex documents. He could follow arguments. He could see, for the first time in his adult life, the architecture of the situation he was living inside. And it made him profoundly miserable. He saw Springfield for what it was. He saw his job for what it was. He saw the gap between the life he had and the life that should have been available to him. And the weight of that gap was unbearable. So he went back to the doctor. He had the crayon reinserted. He chose the fog over the clarity because the clarity was worse. But here's the question the show raises and then quietly drops. How did a crayon come to be lodged in a child's brain in the first place? And how did Homer spend his entire childhood, his adolescence, his adult life, receiving medical care in Springfield, seeing Springfield doctors for regular checkups, without a single one of them identifying a foreign object in his skull? Either Springfield's medical establishment is staggeringly incompetent, or someone knew it was there and made a professional decision not to remove it. If Burns's influence extends into the healthcare infrastructure of a town he essentially owns economically, then the crayon in Homer's brain stops being an accident. It becomes something else. A symptom of a system designed to maintain a population in a state of manageable cognitive limitation. And that population, that yellow-skinned, bulging-eyed, four-fingered community that has been drinking the same water and breathing the same air and living under the shadow of those cracked cooling towers for their entire lives, that community doesn't ask questions. It doesn't organize. It doesn't look up at the plant and connect what they see there to what they see in their mirrors. The radiation theory's most chilling implication isn't the mutation, it's the compliance. The plant doesn't just change their bodies. It changes the part of their minds that would otherwise look at all of this and say, something is deeply wrong here. Springfield isn't quirky, Springfield is symptomatic, and the nuclear power plant that provides its electricity and employs its workers and poisons its water isn't a background detail. It's the engine that makes everything else in the show work the way it works. Every yellow face, every impossible recovery from injury, every moment of collective forgetting after a catastrophe, every child who doesn't age and every mystery that never gets resolved, it all traces back to those two cooling towers at the edge of town, leaking their invisible contamination into everything they touch. The plant is the show, it always has been, and Springfield will never figure that out, because the plant already made sure they can't. Hey, before we drift into the next theory, drop a comment and let us know what time it is where you are right now and where in the world you're watching from. There's something kind of lovely about knowing that someone in Tokyo and someone in Toronto and someone in a small town somewhere are all falling asleep to the same story tonight. Subscribe if you want to stay in Springfield with us. Okay, let's keep going. There's a theory about The Simpsons that, once you hear it stated plainly, never fully leaves you. It sits at the back of your mind every time you watch the show. It reshapes the emotional texture of episodes you've seen 100 times. And it does something that almost no fan theory in television history manages to do. It makes the show better. It makes it more beautiful and more heartbreaking in equal measure. The theory is this: Homer Simpson has been in a coma since April of 1993, and every single episode that has aired since that date is a dream. Let's settle into that idea slowly, because it deserves to be unfolded carefully. On April the 1st, 1993, the 18th episode of Season 4 aired. The episode was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was built around Bart playing a series of escalating April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one more elaborate than the last. The final prank involved Bart taking one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. The can was shaken until the pressure inside it was extreme, then resealed and returned to the refrigerator. When Homer opened the can, the explosion sent him to the hospital. Lying in his hospital bed, groggy and disoriented, Homer saw a vending machine across the room. He wanted a candy bar. He got up to get one, and the machine tipped forward and landed on him. Homer Simpson flatlined. He entered a clinically unconscious state, a real coma, not a cutaway, not a dream sequence used for comedic purposes. The show presented it as something that actually happened within the logic of its own world. Homer was in a coma, and that coma lasted for 7 weeks of in-show time. The episode ends with what appears to be a resolution. Bart, tearful and guilt-ridden, sits at Homer's bedside and confesses that the whole thing was his fault. And Homer springs awake and begins strangling him. The family laughs. Homer laughs. Everything returns to normal. The show moves on. But in the final moments of that episode, something is mentioned and then allowed to sink quietly out of sight. During the coma, Homer lost 5% of his brain function. 5% permanently destroyed, never coming back. When a doctor tells Homer this, Homer's response is to laugh, even though he says out loud that he doesn't understand why he's laughing. His family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The camera pulls back, the credits roll, and the show continues for 32 more years as though nothing significant happened. Unless nothing did happen. Unless that ending, Homer waking up and strangling Bart and the family laughing, was itself part of the dream. Unless Homer never woke up at all. This is the Homer coma theory, and it is the single most widely discussed, most internally consistent, most emotionally resonant fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. Its basic premise is elegant and devastating in equal measure. Homer did not regain consciousness on April the 1st, 1993. Every episode since that date, every storyline and character development and guest appearance and impossible adventure is a dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing neural function, while his family sits beside him and waits for him to open his eyes. The first and most immediately striking piece of evidence is tonal. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a particular kind of show. It was a cartoon, yes, always a cartoon, never attempting realism in any conventional sense. But the storytelling was grounded in recognizable human experience. Homer tried to quit drinking. Marge confronted the possibility of infidelity in her marriage. Lisa developed a complicated emotional attachment to a substitute teacher who treated her as an intellectual equal. Bart struggled with his grades and faced the very real possibility of being held back a year. These were domestic stories. Stories about the textures of ordinary life inside a working-class family. Financial stress, marital tension. The particular loneliness of being a gifted child in an environment that doesn't know what to do with you. After the coma episode, something changes. The shift is not subtle. It's not the kind of thing you have to squint to see. Homer goes to space. He becomes the leader of a vigilante group. He joins a secret society. He meets God. Twice. He discovers that his mother, who he believed dead his entire life, has been a fugitive radical living underground for decades. He befriends celebrities, travels to countries around the world, holds what amounts to dozens of different jobs across seasons and storylines, and survives physical trauma so extreme and so varied that it would have killed an ordinary human being many times over. The show went from a family sitcom built around economic anxiety and domestic conflict to something else entirely, something more surreal, something less tethered to the rules that usually govern the reality of a television family drama. Fans have been debating when The Simpsons changed for 20 years. There's an entire online genre dedicated to pinpointing the moment the show lost the quality of its early seasons. And the answers vary. Some people say season 9, some say season 10. Some say the transition was gradual, a slow drift rather than a clean break. The coma theory offers a different answer, and it's a precise one. The Simpsons didn't change. Homer's brain got worse. What the audience experiences as tonal drift, as the show becoming more cartoonish and less grounded, is actually the faithful documentation of a deteriorating mind. Dreams don't stay coherent. They don't maintain consistent internal logic across time. They escalate. They become more vivid and more strange. They introduce impossible elements without explanation because the sleeping mind that generates them has no filter for plausibility. And as the brain generating the dream loses function, as the neurons that maintain order and coherence begin to fade, the dream itself becomes more unstable, more surreal, more reliant on spectacle and less anchored to the emotional core that originally gave it meaning. That's the arc of The Simpsons after season 4. It's not the writers getting lazy, it's Homer's mind getting dimmer. And there's a detail planted 6 months before the coma episode that retrospectively feels like a prophecy. In the season 4 premiere, Homer the Heretic, Homer has a conversation with God, an actual conversation, face to face, in a dream sequence that the show presents with its characteristic mix of comedy and genuine spiritual weight. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. He tells him that Homer will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. His time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. Under normal viewing conditions, that line from God reads as a theological joke, a gentle gag about Homer's unconventional relationship with divinity. But read through the lens of the coma theory, God was telling Homer something true. His conscious life was approaching its end. Everything that mattered, everything he would ever truly experience and carry and treasure, was about to become inaccessible to him. His time was coming, and 6 months later, it arrived. Now here's the piece of evidence that the coma theory handles more elegantly than any other theory ever proposed. Nobody in The Simpsons ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge exist in a permanent middle age, untouched by the passage of time in a way that no amount of expensive skincare could actually achieve. The show uses what's called a floating timeline, meaning the present is always the present. The year the episode airs is the year the characters are living in. Technology changes around them. Cultural references update, but the characters themselves remain frozen. Every theory about The Simpsons has to wrestle with this. The floating timeline is the most obvious and fundamental strangeness of the show's reality, and it demands an explanation. The radiation theory says the mutations have altered their biology at a cellular level, slowing or halting the aging process. The standard industry explanation says it's just how animated shows work, a production convenience that allows a show to run indefinitely without its characters becoming elderly. The coma theory has the simplest answer, and it's the one that stays with you. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen memory of an unconscious man. Homer went to sleep in April of 1993. At that moment, his children were the ages they were. His wife looked the way she looked. His friends and neighbors and colleagues had the faces and voices and habits they had. The world of Evergreen Terrace was exactly as it was on the day the vending machine fell. And Homer's dreaming mind cannot imagine them growing older, because it has no reference material for that. It can only work with what it knew, the last snapshot of reality before consciousness went out like a light. Of course, Bart is still 10. Homer never saw Bart turn 11. He was in a coma when it would have happened, if it happened at all. Of course, Lisa is still 8, and Maggie is still 1, and Marge still looks exactly the way she looked on the last morning Homer was truly awake. The dream preserves them because it has no other version of them to draw from. Homer's coma locks them in amber, and they stay there, perfect and unchanging, while the world outside the hospital room ages without him. Dreams do that. They freeze things at the moment of their last true knowing. They reconstruct a world from incomplete materials and run it forward. And what gets lost in the reconstruction is the passage of time, because sleeping minds don't experience time the way waking ones do. They experience it in loops, in episodes, in cycles that reset and begin again, which is, of course, exactly how The Simpsons is structured. Each episode begins fresh. Consequences from previous episodes evaporate. Catastrophes are forgotten. The status quo restores itself with uncanny reliability. Homer falls off a cliff and the next week he's fine. Springfield is destroyed and the next week it's whole. A friendship is shattered and the next episode it's intact. The reset button is pressed invisibly between every installment, and the show continues as though nothing accumulated. This is normally explained as a convention of episodic television. Stories need to be self-contained. You can't carry every consequence forward indefinitely. But the coma theory offers a more poetic reason. The dream resets because Homer's mind resets. Each episode is a new dream cycle. Each cycle begins with the world as Homer last knew it, runs through a story generated by his unconscious mind, and then dissolves back into the starting position when the cycle ends. The world always goes back to normal because Homer's dreaming brain can't hold on to deviation. It always snaps back to the baseline, the home it remembers, the family it's trying to protect. The celebrity appearances that flood the later seasons of the show also find an explanation here that feels right. Homer is in a hospital. Hospitals have televisions, radios, ambient sound, people visit, conversations happen near his bed, cultural media filters through the walls. His dreaming mind receives fragments of the outside world through the fog of unconsciousness, hears names and voices and references, and incorporates them into the dream. Every celebrity who appears in Springfield, every famous guest who wanders through the story for an episode, is a voice Homer heard through the fog. A fragment of external reality absorbed by a brain desperately trying to keep its simulation running, stitched into the dream as a character because the dreaming mind works with whatever material it can find. The show itself has acknowledged this theory in a way that is simultaneously an admission and a denial, which is somehow very characteristic of Springfield. In season 34, an episode called Lisa the Boy Scout included what was described as a deliberately leaked, fake deleted scene. A piece of footage that appeared to show Homer waking from a long coma, with the revelation that every outlandish episode had been a dream. The show's writers animated this scene. They showed it to the audience. And then they labeled it a hoax, a scene planted by hackers that wasn't real. But the fact that they made it at all is significant. The writers know about the theory. They have engaged with it seriously enough to animate it. They've acknowledged that it holds together, that it has internal consistency, that it provides an explanation for things the official story of the show cannot fully account for. And their denial of it came packaged inside an episode that explicitly depicted Homer waking from a coma. They showed you the truth and told you it was a joke, and the audience laughed, just like Homer laughed when the doctor told him he'd lost 5% of his brain, laughing at something he didn't fully understand. The show's executive producer addressed the theory publicly in 2015 and dismissed it as fan speculation. He said it simply wasn't true. And that's a perfectly valid thing to say from the perspective of someone who works on the show and knows how its stories are constructed. But what he didn't address was the aging freeze. He didn't explain the tonal shift. He didn't explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He didn't explain why the show has become progressively more surreal with each passing season, in precisely the way you'd expect from a dream generated by a brain slowly losing its capacity for coherent narrative. He said it wasn't true, and the interviewer moved on. But here is the thing about the coma theory that separates it from every other piece of Simpsons speculation. It doesn't just explain the mysteries, it transforms the emotional meaning of the show. If Homer is dreaming, then The Simpsons isn't a comedy about a hapless dad making stupid mistakes. It's a story about what a man loves so much that it's the last thing his mind holds on to when everything else falls away. Homer's dream doesn't give him wealth or adventure or power. It gives him his family, exactly as he left them. It gives him Bart being mischievous and loud and alive. It gives him Lisa playing her saxophone and being furious at the world and brilliant in ways that break your heart. It gives him Maggie's small, warm weight and the sound of her pacifier. It gives him Marge, patient and beautiful and still there, still choosing him, the way she always chose him even when he didn't deserve it. The dream gives him Friday evenings on the couch, beer that's cold and football on the television, the smell of the house, the particular sound of his family moving through their routines. All of it preserved, none of it taken away. Homer's coma isn't a nightmare. It's the only version of heaven that a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. And every impossible survival, every time he falls off a cliff or gets electrocuted or walks away from something that should have ended him, the coma theory has the simplest explanation for that too. Nothing can kill Homer in the dream because the dream is the one telling the story. His body isn't in Springfield. His body is in a hospital bed. Only his mind is in Springfield, and his mind is the author, and authors don't kill themselves. The story keeps going because Homer needs it to keep going. Because the moment it stops, The moment the dream finally ends and the simulation crashes, Homer has to wake up. And waking up means finding out how much time has passed, how old his children really are now, whether Marge is still in the waiting room or whether she had to stop waiting eventually, whether anyone is still there, or it means not waking up at all. Which is perhaps the most honest version of the ending this show will ever get, though it will never say so out loud. Every episode you've ever watched, from the moment that vending machine fell in April of 1993, is a love letter from an unconscious father to the family he can't reach. That's what the coma theory is. That's what it's always been. And the show will never confirm it, but it will never disprove it either, because the evidence is woven into the structure of the show itself, stitched into every reset and every frozen child and every impossible recovery. Homer always finds his way home by the end of the episode, because in his dream he never left. There are mysteries that get solved and mysteries that get closed, and in Springfield those are two very different things. The summer of 1995 was one of the most genuinely exciting moments in the history of American television, and it centered on a question about a fictional character that somehow felt urgent and real. The Simpsons had constructed a murder mystery, a proper, committed, go-all-the-way whodunit executed with more craft and attention than most actual crime dramas manage. And the question it asked, who shot Mr. Burns, became a cultural phenomenon that outlasted the episode that answered it, because the answer the show gave was compelling on the surface and deeply unsatisfying once you looked at it closely. Let's go back to the beginning. Season 6, Episode 25, Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1. The setup is methodical and patient. Over the course of the episode, Burns accumulates a list of enemies that reads like a comprehensive survey of everyone in Springfield. He steals an oil well discovered beneath Springfield Elementary, gutting the school's budget and eliminating its music program and library funding in a single stroke. He manipulates the resulting financial chaos to drive Moe's Tavern into bankruptcy. The reverberations of the oil extraction create a sinkhole that collapses the Springfield retirement castle. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, is injured when the equipment strikes him. And then, as though deciding that all of this wasn't quite enough, Burns unveils his grand plan. He has constructed a massive mechanical sun-blocking device, a disc that can be positioned to block sunlight from reaching Springfield, forcing the entire town to purchase electricity from his power plant because they will have no access to natural light and warmth. He deploys it. Springfield goes dark. Smithers, Burns's loyal assistant, objects. He argues that this has crossed a line, that deliberately stealing sunlight from an entire community is something he cannot participate in. Burns fires him on the spot. By the time the first episode ends, every single person in Springfield has a motive. The show doesn't gesture at this vaguely. It demonstrates it explicitly, giving each major character a specific, personal grievance tied directly to Burns's actions. Homer, who has spent years being unable to get Burns to remember his name. Bart and Lisa, whose school lost its funding. Grandpa Simpson, whose retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, who lost his job. Tito Puente, who lost the music program he had been brought in to run. Moe, whose tavern was driven under. Even Smithers, freshly fired, spiraling into alcoholism and grief. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns. Multiple characters were shown holding weapons. The tension had been wound as tightly as the show's writers could manage. Then Burns collapsed. A single gunshot wound. He staggered to a town sundial and fell against it, his hands coming to rest on two specific letters, W and S, or, from his perspective, looking back at his own hands, M and S. He was carried away by ambulance. The screen went black. America waited 3 months. When Part 2 aired in September 1995, the investigation played out as a comedic procedural. Chief Wiggum and his department fumbled through the evidence with their characteristic incompetence. Smithers confessed almost immediately, but his confession was useless. He had been blackout drunk at the time of the shooting and had, in his inebriated state, shot an entirely different person, specifically old Jasper, in his wooden leg, not Burns. Different victim, different location, different crime. Suspects were systematically eliminated. Alibis were established. Tito Puente's alibi was, by general agreement, the greatest in the history of the genre. He had channeled his rage into a samba, and the musical number in which he explained this was both his proof of innocence and one of the episode's most memorable moments. The investigation stalled until a key piece of physical evidence emerged. An eyelash had been found on Burns's suit. DNA analysis was conducted. The eyelash belonged to a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints were found on the gun. He had the clearest, most personal, most documented motive of anyone in town. Burns had been unable to remember Homer's name for years, despite Homer working directly for him, a humiliation that the show had established as a source of genuine psychological wound for Homer. He was arrested. He was on the verge of conviction. And then Burns woke up from his coma. He looked around the hospital room, and he named his shooter. Maggie, baby Maggie Simpson, 1-year-old. According to Burns's account, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting and had attempted to take her lollipop. In the resulting struggle, his firearm fell from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. The case was closed. Except it wasn't. Let's start with the contest, because the contest reveals something important about whether the official answer actually follows from the available evidence. Fox ran a national competition to coincide with the mystery. Viewers were invited to submit their guesses for who shot Burns. The prize was significant. The winner would be animated into a future episode of the show. Thousands of entries were received. And, according to the DVD commentary for the episode, not a single person from the sample of randomly selected entries submitted the correct answer. Nobody won. The person eventually awarded the prize was chosen at random from the pool, and because they hadn't identified the correct answer, they received a cash payment rather than the animated appearance. The show's writers acknowledged on the commentary that they knew of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer online on the night the original episode broadcast to a Simpsons newsgroup. But this person had been using a college internet account that was no longer active by the time the contest ended. They couldn't be located. The show even extended an open invitation on the DVD release for that person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Think about what that means. The creators constructed a mystery they described as solvable from the clues in Part 1. They promoted a national contest around the solvability of that mystery, and when the answer was revealed, essentially nobody in the entire country had arrived at it through the evidence. Either the clues were insufficient, or the red herrings were too effective, or the answer didn't actually follow logically from the evidence the way the show claimed it did. Now look at some of the specific evidence more carefully. Burns fell against the sundial. His hands landed on W and S, or from his own perspective, M and S. The show tells us this points to Maggie Simpson. M for Maggie, S for Simpson. But Burns himself stated, canonically and on the record within the episode, that this positioning was not intentional. He didn't deliberately reach for those letters. He simply fell, and his hands came to rest where they did. The central physical clue in one of the most celebrated mysteries in television history was explicitly described by the victim as a coincidence. Burns said so. Within the episode, out loud. Then there's the question of the gun. Burns carried his firearm in a holster. The show establishes, shortly before the shooting, that the holster is empty. The gun was already gone from Burns's person before the attack happened. Whoever shot Burns used Burns's own weapon, a weapon that was taken from him at some point either during or immediately before the confrontation. This narrows the profile of the shooter considerably. The shooter wasn't someone who came to the town meeting prepared to commit violence. Most of the suspects had brought their own weapons. They were angry enough to arm themselves before they arrived. The shooter was someone who didn't plan to fire anything that night, who came without a weapon, who encountered Burns's gun by chance in the chaos and used it in an unplanned moment. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits that profile. So does anyone who arrived at the meeting unarmed and encountered the loose firearm during the confrontation. And then there's Burns's last words before the shot. He saw his attacker and he said, "Oh, it's you." Not, "Who are you?" Not a sound of surprise or alarm. He recognized the person approaching him. The phrasing suggests familiarity. The phrasing suggests someone Burns had interacted with before. Someone whose presence in that moment didn't trigger any sense of danger. Does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? The show offers almost no prior interaction between them. Burns barely recognizes Homer after years of direct employment. The idea that he would see a baby approaching him in a parking lot and respond with the warm recognition of, "Oh, it's you," as though greeting a familiar acquaintance, strains against everything the show has established about Burns's relationship to the people in Homer's family. Then there's the matter of Season 18, where Homer, apparently unprompted, tells someone that he was actually the one who shot Burns. He says it out loud, on camera, as a statement of apparent fact. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the richest man in town, and the show treats it as a throwaway moment and moves on. Either Homer is lying, which is entirely possible given his character, or the original verdict was wrong, and Homer knows it because he's the one who pulled the trigger. If Homer did it, then the DNA evidence pointing to a Simpson was correct. The fingerprints were correct. The motive was the clearest of anyone's. Every piece of evidence that was redirected toward Maggie actually pointed at Homer from the beginning, and Maggie was the perfect person to redirect it to. Chief Wiggum says it explicitly. No jury in the world would convict a baby. An infant can't be prosecuted. An infant can't deny the accusation in any way that a courtroom would take seriously. Maggie was the safest possible answer because Maggie was the only suspect in Springfield who was completely immune from consequence. The Marge theory has also circulated for years, and it's more structurally compelling than it might initially seem. The case goes like this. Marge is a devoted and protective mother who watched Burns systematically dismantle the institutions that support her children. The school, the retirement home where her father-in-law lives. She watched Burns injure her family's dog. She watched him steal the sun from her town. She had motive that was as strong as anyone's. But the specific detail that makes the Marge theory interesting is a story that predates the shooting. Burns became infatuated with Marge in a previous episode. The show established that Burns holds something approaching a romantic interest in her. And if Burns woke up from his coma and saw Marge's face, and recognized it as the face of the woman who shot him, the theory argues that he wouldn't name her. He would protect her. He would point at the sundial and let the town draw its own conclusions, because the alternative was sending the woman he'd been fixated on to prison. Maggie wasn't named because the evidence pointed to her. Maggie was named because she was convenient, and because whoever the real shooter was, whether Homer or Marge or someone else entirely, naming Maggie solved the problem without creating a new one. The alternate endings that were fully produced and animated deepened the uncertainty. A complete alternate conclusion was made in which Smithers was revealed as the shooter, fully voiced, fully animated. A finished alternate version of the episode's resolution that was shown in a clip show and then dismissed. The dismissal itself was a wink. The clip show host explained that the Smithers ending wouldn't have worked because the Simpson DNA evidence would have to be ignored, which would be, and this is the direct quote from the show, downright nutty. This line was a direct reference to the O.J. Simpson trial, where a jury had recently ignored DNA evidence to reach an acquittal. The show was pointing at something. It was saying out loud that ignoring DNA evidence happens, that juries do it, that official verdicts and forensic truth don't always point in the same direction. The show's own creators cycled through multiple shooters before landing on Maggie. Barney Gumble was seriously considered at one point. The evidence wasn't discovered and then matched to the shooter. The shooter was chosen and then the evidence was adjusted to fit. The mystery was reverse engineered, and the final shot of Part 2 does something that neither confirms nor denies any of this, but refuses to let you rest comfortably with the official answer. Everyone has left the hospital room. Maggie is alone. She looks around carefully, deliberately, making sure nobody is watching. Then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation. Maggie did it, and she knows what she did. But watch it again. A baby imitating a gesture she witnessed is exactly what babies do. They mirror, they repeat, they reconstruct behaviors they've observed without necessarily understanding them. Maggie didn't necessarily confess in that moment. She might have been remembering. She might have been replaying something she saw someone else do, imitating the adult who was actually holding the gun, the way babies imitate the adults around them without comprehension of what those actions mean. Who shot Mr. Burns? The show says Maggie. The evidence suggests Homer. The logic of Burns's behavior suggests Marge. The structure of the mystery suggests the answer was chosen for convenience rather than derived from the clues. In Springfield, cases get closed, not solved. And in Springfield, those are two very different things. Mr. Burns is old. This is not a controversial statement. It is, however, a statement that becomes increasingly strange the more seriously you take it. The show has placed his birth at various points across the late 19th century. Different episodes offer different numbers, but the consistent picture across decades of storytelling is that Burns was born somewhere around the 1880s. He has personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described first-hand experiences of events from the early 1900s with the casual authority of someone recalling their own youth. He served in World War II, which places him at military service age in the 1940s, which means he would have been born no later than the early 1920s by the most conservative reading. But the show, repeatedly and explicitly, places his birth earlier than that. By the most measured estimate, Burns is well over 100 years old. By some readings of the show's internal continuity, he could be pushing 140. And he doesn't just exist. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with the kind of operational precision that requires sustained cognitive function, long-term strategic planning, and an ongoing working understanding of modern finance, modern law, and modern technology. His body is frail, his physical strength is almost non-existent. He is depicted as being so weak that a single bee landing on him can knock him to the ground. But his mind is razor-sharp. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, operating with a ruthlessness and foresight that no one in the town can match. And he has been operating at that level for longer than any human being should be able to sustain consciousness. The show explains how he does it, in a moment that's presented as a comedy beat and then never fully revisited. In the episode called The Springfield Files, which also gives us the Springfield Files alien revelation we discussed in the radiation section, the mystery of who Homer saw glowing in the woods is ultimately resolved. The glowing figure wasn't an alien. It was Burns. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment, an intensive regimen so chemically and radiologically extreme that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow in its aftermath. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly one more week. Without it, he will die within days. The margin for error is zero. The show plays this as a punchline. The alien is just Burns after his medical appointment, wandering through the forest in a dazed, euphoric post-treatment state. The mystery deflates into comedy, and the episode moves on. But stop there for a moment and hold what was just said. Burns is not surviving through natural biological processes. He is being kept alive through a recurring medical intervention that has to be administered on a precise weekly schedule. His life is maintained the way you maintain a machine, through scheduled servicing, through controlled inputs that prevent his system from failing. And crucially, the treatment involves radiation. The man who owns Springfield's nuclear power plant, the man whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into the town's water supply for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to sustain his own biological function. Burns isn't just profiting from nuclear power. His body requires nuclear input to continue operating. Take it away and his system shut down within a week. This creates a closed loop of extraordinary and somewhat disturbing elegance. Burns poisons Springfield with radiation. That same radiation, managed in controlled doses by his personal medical team, is what keeps him alive. The town is essentially subsidizing his immortality through its contamination. The show goes further. In one of the series' most quoted scenes, Burns visits a doctor for what appears to be a standard examination. The doctor's findings are delivered with the calm affect of someone reading a grocery list, which is part of what makes the scene so effective. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Every single one, simultaneously present in his body at the same moment. The doctor explains the situation. All of Burns's diseases are fighting each other. Each illness that would otherwise kill him is being prevented from doing so by every other illness that wants the same outcome. They're gridlocked. They've reached a state of perfect biological equilibrium in which each disease cancels out every other disease, and the result is that none of them can progress. The doctor calls this Three Stooges syndrome, comparing it to the image of three large people attempting to pass through a narrow doorway simultaneously. None of them can get through because they're all trying at the same time. Burns, the doctor concludes, is the sickest man in the United States. He is also, functionally, indestructible, because everything that should kill him is being blocked by everything else that wants to kill him first. This scene is played for laughs. It's a highlight reel moment that fans quote for decades after first seeing it. But read through the lens of what the show has established about Burns's weekly treatment regimen, it reveals something that operates beyond comedy. Burns isn't maintaining this disease equilibrium through any natural biological process. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. They aren't curing his diseases, they're managing them. They're calibrating the balance, keeping every illness in precisely the equilibrium required to prevent any single one from gaining dominance and breaking through. It's not medicine in any conventional sense. It's nuclear maintenance. Burns's body is functioning like a reactor, and the weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods to prevent a meltdown. Smithers understands this. This is the piece of the Burns-Smithers relationship that the show has never stated explicitly, but has consistently implied across decades of storytelling. Smithers manages Burns's schedule with an attention to detail that borders on the obsessive. He ensures Burns makes every appointment, monitors his physical condition with continuous vigilance, and positions himself as the one indispensable element of Burns's daily existence. The show has demonstrated repeatedly that if Smithers were removed from his position, Burns would be helpless in ways that go beyond the emotional. Without someone managing the treatment schedule with Smithers's precision, Burns would miss a dose. The disease equilibrium would collapse. Every illness in his body would surge simultaneously, and the result would be catastrophic. Smithers isn't devoted to Burns out of love and loyalty alone, though the show depicts that component of their relationship with a great deal of warmth over the years. He's devoted because he understands the mechanics of what keeps Burns alive, and he knows that his absence is effectively a death sentence. The devotion has a practical dimension that most readings of their relationship overlook. Smithers keeps Burns alive through logistical competence. That knowledge, that he holds Burns's continued existence in his scheduling calendar, forms the hidden foundation beneath everything else between them. And then there's the historical dimension. Burns has described personal involvement in events spanning from the early 20th century through the present day. He knew Howard Hughes. He attended Yale. He served in World War II in a role that the show describes with deliberate moral ambiguity. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and kept it concealed for decades. He has referenced the Gilded Age as personal experience rather than history. His family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The show has depicted the Burns family dynasty as one of the oldest, most continuously powerful lineages in American history. Not wealthy in the way that most wealthy families are wealthy, building success in one generation and maintaining it across the next. The Burns family has been in continuous control of their fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of continuity doesn't happen through ordinary generational succession. It requires either extraordinary luck or extraordinary measures. And here is the question that the show raises without ever answering. If the current Burns has been alive for over a century through artificial medical means, what were the Burns family's methods for extending their hold on power before nuclear radiation and modern medicine were available? Did previous Burns patriarchs employ different strategies for the same purpose? The show doesn't say, but it does establish that the family's continuity is unusual, that the accumulation of power across multiple generations suggests something beyond normal inheritance. Burns's relationship with death itself is also worth examining carefully. He has come closer to dying than almost any other character on the show. He was shot by Maggie Simpson and survived. He's been hospitalized dozens of times. He's collapsed, fallen, been attacked, been abandoned in the wilderness, been poisoned, been exposed to conditions that would end the life of any ordinary person. And every time, he returns. Not through the cartoon resilience that allows Homer to survive falls off cliffs and electrocutions. Homer endures damage and heals, seemingly through the physical invulnerability granted by whatever his body has become. Burns doesn't survive through resilience. Burns survives through infrastructure. Every dollar he has ever spent on medical research, every doctor he has ever retained, every politician he has ever purchased, every regulatory body he has ever neutralized, all of it serves one fundamental purpose: ensure that no matter what happens to Burns's body, there will always be someone standing by with the resources and the expertise to repair the damage and resume the maintenance schedule. Homer's immortality is passive. It happens to him regardless of any action he takes, because his mutated biology simply refuses to allow consequences to accumulate in his tissue. Burns's immortality is engineered. He built the system that keeps him alive over the course of a lifetime and more. It is deliberate, expensive, and entirely dependent on the continued operation of an empire that exists, at its most fundamental level, to generate the wealth and infrastructure required to keep its owner breathing. Burns doesn't have to be lucky. He has to be rich. And he has ensured, through a century of careful cultivation of power, that his wealth is self-sustaining. The corporation keeps itself running. The corporation generates the money. The money funds the medical program. The medical program keeps Burns alive. Burns makes decisions that grow the corporation. The loop is closed. The scariest part of this isn't that Burns might live forever. It's that Springfield has become structurally dependent on his continued existence. The town's economy runs on the power plant. The power plant runs because Burns owns it and operates it. Burns can only continue to operate it because of the weekly treatments that his wealth funds. If Burns dies, the chain breaks. The plant's ownership becomes uncertain. The economy destabilizes. The workforce loses its largest employer. The infrastructure that the entire town runs on becomes a question mark. Springfield cannot afford to let Burns die. And Burns, who has spent a century engineering his own indispensability, understands this perfectly. He isn't immortal. He's something more durable than that. He's too expensive to die. And Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on, which, given his treatment schedule, may well be forever. There is one episode of The Simpsons that fans have debated and dismissed and argued about for nearly 30 years, an episode that is consistently ranked among the worst in the series. That has been called the moment the show betrayed its audience, abandoned its own continuity, and stopped caring about internal consistency. That episode is The Principal and the Pauper, Season 9, Episode 2, which aired on September the 28th, 1997. And the argument tonight is that this episode is not the worst thing The Simpsons ever did to itself. It's the most important thing, because it's the only episode that shows you exactly how Springfield works. Here's what happens. Springfield Elementary holds an event to celebrate Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. In the middle of the celebration, a stranger walks in, a man nobody recognizes. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war and was believed dead. He survived, he escaped, he came home, and he came home to find that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Seymour Skinner is revealed to be an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before Vietnam, Tamzarian was a street punk, a petty criminal from the wrong side of the tracks with no prospects and no future. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. And when Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to Skinner's mother, Agnes. When he arrived, Agnes assumed he was her son. She needed him to be her son. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had never had a family or an identity worth inhabiting, went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took his name and his rank and his relationship with Agnes and his life, and he lived inside that stolen identity for 20 years until the real man walked through the door and the entire structure collapsed. Everything that Springfield thought it knew about Seymour Skinner, his military service, his relationship with Agnes, his history, his personality, was built on a foundation that didn't exist. Now watch what Springfield does with this information. The town holds a meeting. Both men are present. The truth is fully exposed. Everyone knows that their principal is a fraud. The real Seymour Skinner is standing in front of them, alive, with documentation, with his actual identity intact and verifiable. And Springfield votes. Not on whether to prosecute Tamzarian, not on how to navigate the complicated question of a man who built a genuine life and genuine relationships inside a stolen identity. Not even on what the right and fair thing to do might be for both parties. Springfield votes on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict is unanimous. They vote to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree that the imposter is the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero who survived a prisoner of war camp and returned home to find his life occupied by someone else, is tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from the town. And the judge makes it explicitly illegal to ever mention what actually happened, under penalty of torture. Fans hated this. The backlash was immediate and sustained. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner among other characters, stated publicly that he found the storyline deeply objectionable. Critics argued that the episode destroyed Skinner as a character by revealing that everything the audience thought they knew about him was fiction. His military history, his relationship with his mother, his dynamic with Bart, his entire personality, all of it retroactively constructed on a lie. The episode is cited regularly as the moment the show lost its moral compass. But here's the thing that nobody wants to say. The episode is completely honest about what Springfield is. It just says the quiet part out loud. Springfield has always operated exactly this way. The town has always chosen comfortable fictions over uncomfortable truths. The town has always collectively agreed to forget whatever doesn't fit the preferred version of reality. The entire history of the show, the three-eyed fish ignored after a news cycle, the dome under which the EPA sealed the town forgotten by the next episode, the nuclear near misses that leave no lasting trace, all of it follows the same underlying logic. The only thing the principal and the pauper does differently is show you the mechanism. It shows you the vote. It shows you the legal decree. It shows you the actual expulsion of truth from the community, performed openly and formally and without embarrassment. Every other time Springfield forgets a catastrophe or resets to normal after something world-altering, it happens off-screen. Between episodes, in the invisible gap between the credits of one installment and the opening of the next, the town's amnesia happens somewhere you can't see it. This episode showed you what that amnesia actually looks like when it's performed in public, and the audience was horrified, not because Springfield did something out of character, but because they had to watch. Think about how many times Springfield has experienced events that should permanently alter the town's reality. The dome, the sun being blocked out, the various environmental catastrophes, the alien encounters, the investigations by federal agencies. The show has put Springfield through genuine, world-shaking, impossible-to-ignore events and then reset to normal the following week as though they never happened. This is normal. Every long-running episodic show does some version of this. But The Simpsons does it with a consistency and a scale that goes beyond production convenience. The principal and the pauper offers an explanation for why. Springfield resets because Springfield chooses to reset, deliberately, through a social contract that operates below the level of explicit discussion but surfaces here, in this episode, in the form of an actual vote. We will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed version of reality. We will treat the lie as truth and the truth as criminal. And anyone who breaks this contract will be removed from the community. That's not a cartoon trope. That's a genuine social dynamic. Small communities in particular have a remarkable capacity for collective denial. Scandals get buried. Inconvenient histories get rewritten. Uncomfortable facts get smoothed over until the official narrative is the only narrative anyone remembers. The mechanism Springfield deploys is just more explicit, more theatrical, more honest in its dishonesty than the versions that happen in real places. And under the lens of the radiation theory, this episode takes on an additional dimension. If the population of Springfield has been cognitively affected by decades of nuclear contamination, if the part of their brains responsible for critical thinking and sustained memory has been compromised by chronic neurological damage, then their collective amnesia isn't purely a choice. It's also a symptom. The vote to forget is easier to reach when remembering is neurologically difficult. The social contract to deny is easier to maintain when the brains maintaining it have already been eroded. The town doesn't forget because its residents are stupid. The town forgets because remembering is genuinely hard, and because the alternative, actually reckoning with the full picture of what Springfield is and what has been done to it, would require confronting things that the entire structure of the community is built to prevent anyone from confronting. If they remembered the dome, they'd have to acknowledge the pollution. If they acknowledged the pollution, they'd have to confront the plant. If they confronted the plant, they'd have to challenge Burns. If they challenged Burns, the economy would collapse. If the economy collapsed, the town would cease to function as a viable community. So they forget. They vote to forget. They make it illegal to remember. And anyone who insists on remembering, anyone who shows up with proof that the official story is a lie, gets tied to a railroad car. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary in the coal mine. He was a man who arrived with evidence that the community had been organized around a fiction, and Springfield's response wasn't gratitude for the truth. It was criminalization of the truth and exile for the person delivering it. That's not a comedy beat. That's the show showing you the machinery of Springfield's impossible reality, the mechanism that allows a town to forget everything, the social infrastructure that makes every reset possible. And if the coma theory is true, this episode has one final layer of meaning that makes it almost unbearable. If everything since season 4 is Homer's dream, then Homer's unconscious mind invented a scenario in which an entire community votes to sustain a fiction because it needs to. Because the alternative is worse than the lie. Homer needs to believe this is possible. He needs to believe that a stolen identity can become real through collective agreement, that the fake version of a life can replace the real one and hold together indefinitely, as long as everyone agrees not to look too closely. Because that's what his coma is. A fake life replacing a real one, a dream masquerading as consciousness. And as long as nobody questions it, as long as the dream town of Springfield keeps voting to maintain the fiction, Homer never has to wake up. The Principal and the Pauper is the most important episode of The Simpsons, not because it's good, though there are arguments to be made for it, and not because fans enjoyed it, which they manifestly didn't. It's the most important episode because it's the only one that takes the show's central operating logic and puts it on stage in broad daylight. Springfield forgets because forgetting is safer than remembering. Springfield lies because the truth would cost too much. And Springfield expels anyone who tells the truth because honest people are the only genuine threat to a community built on comfortable fictions. Armin Tamzarian is still pretending to be Seymour Skinner. The town is still pretending everything is fine. And the real Seymour Skinner is still out there somewhere, exiled from his own identity by legal decree, the last honest man in a town that made honesty a crime. Maggie Simpson does not speak. This is the first thing anyone says about Maggie, and it's usually said as a descriptor of limitation. She's a baby. She can't walk reliably. She communicates through sounds and gestures and the pointed stare that she deploys with an accuracy that most adults could not replicate with words. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years, and in that time, without a single sentence, she has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. Let's put it plainly. Maggie Simpson has shot a billionaire. She led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical administrator. She has saved her family from multiple life-threatening situations. She has demonstrated problem-solving abilities that exceed those of adults many times her age in situations that would cause most grown humans to panic and fail. And she has done all of this while maintaining, without deviation, the exterior presentation of a completely unremarkable infant who is not to be taken seriously. That last part is not an accident. Start with the shooting, because it established the template. Whether or not Maggie intentionally pulled the trigger when Burns fell, and we've explored the uncertainty around that already, the aftermath reveals something about how Maggie operates in the world. After Burns named Maggie as his shooter, the police investigated. The evidence was examined. Chief Wiggum arrived at a conclusion that he stated out loud without apparent irony. No jury in the world would convict a baby. Possibly Texas, but not generally. And that was the end of it. A baby was identified as the person who shot the most powerful and feared man in Springfield, and the consequence was nothing. 0. The investigation closed. Life resumed. Maggie returned to her usual position in the household, sitting on the living room floor, pacifier in mouth, watching everything. The final shot of that episode, the one we keep returning to because it resists simple interpretation, shows Maggie alone in the hospital room after everyone else has left. She checks her surroundings. She makes sure nobody is watching, and then she moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. If you read this as confession, Maggie did it and knows she did it, and is reliving the moment in private. If you read it as mimicry, Maggie witnessed someone else fire the gun and is reproducing the gesture the way babies reproduce adult behaviors they've observed, without understanding, but with precise physical imitation. Either way, the sequence requires a specific set of cognitive capacities that shouldn't exist in a 1-year-old. She waited until she was alone. She confirmed her surroundings were clear. She chose a private moment to express something she understood to be significant. That sequence implies situational awareness, memory retention, causal reasoning, and impulse control. The kind of deliberate behavioral management you associate with a person who understands consequences and has decided that secrecy is the preferred strategy. Those are not infant behaviors. Those are the behaviors of someone who is thinking. In 2012, the show released a theatrical short film called The Longest Daycare, 7 minutes long, nominated for an Academy Award, and more revealing about Maggie Simpson than almost anything in the full-length series. Maggie is dropped off at the Ayn Rand School for Tots, a daycare center run with authoritarian efficiency. Inside the facility, she discovers a caterpillar that is about to become a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another baby, A bully named Gerald wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action story in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the staff, and the facility's security systems to protect the caterpillar and release the butterfly into the outside world. She does this entirely without words, without help, without anyone noticing what she's doing until it's already done. The cognitive operations on display during those 7 minutes are remarkable. She reads the environment and identifies threats. She develops strategies that require multiple steps to execute. She adapts in real time when obstacles appear. She predicts the behavior of other people, the bully, the staff, so accurately that she can work around them without confrontation. She executes plans that require precise timing, spatial awareness, and the capacity to hold a multi-part goal in mind while managing immediate challenges. Her body can barely keep up. She falls. She crawls when she should be able to run. Her motor development is genuinely limited in the way a 1-year-old's motor development actually is limited. But her decision-making is flawless. Every choice she makes is correct. Every adaptation she executes is optimal. Her intelligence compensates for every physical limitation her body imposes. The show has tested her intelligence directly across multiple episodes. The results vary, because the show is not always internally consistent, but the pattern is the same. When Maggie's intelligence is measured or revealed, the results are extraordinary. Off the charts. Beyond what standardized testing can accurately capture, the show treats this as a quick joke and moves on. But the accumulation of these moments across 36 seasons creates a picture of a child whose cognitive capacity is genuinely abnormal. Not in the limited direction that the Simpson family sometimes exhibits. In the opposite direction entirely. And then there's the silence. Maggie's first word was spoken once. In a moment the show treated as a special event, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor as a cameo appearance. The word was "Daddy," and it was never repeated. Maggie has gone 36 years in a household full of extremely verbal people without developing language in any meaningful ongoing way. Homer never stops talking. Marge communicates in a constant stream of worrying and managing and expressing. Bart is relentlessly loud and provocative. Lisa lectures and argues and articulates herself with a precision unusual for someone her age. The Simpson household is a wall of noise, an environment saturated with language and communication. And in the middle of all of it, Maggie sits in silence, watching, listening, processing. The theory, the one that feels right when you sit with it, is that Maggie's silence is not a developmental limitation. It's a strategic decision. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in this family and in this town. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. Her IQ dwarfs everyone in the household and most of the adults in Springfield. And the return on that intelligence has been isolation, mockery, and consistent dismissal by a community that does not reward insight. Lisa speaks and gets ignored. Lisa challenges authority and gets punished for it. Lisa tries to improve the world around her and gets crushed by the weight of a community that is structurally organized to resist improvement. Her intelligence is her most defining trait and simultaneously her greatest source of suffering, because she deploys it visibly. She announces it. She wears it on the outside. And the outside world responds by making sure she understands how little that matters. Maggie has watched this happen since the day she was born. She has observed, from her position on the floor and in her high chair and in her car seat, the most intelligent person in the family fight every single day for recognition and receive nothing but resistance. She has run the experiment with the available data and reached a conclusion about what visible intelligence produces in Springfield. And she drew the opposite lesson from the one Lisa drew. Lisa's lesson was to keep fighting, to maintain the argument regardless of the cost, to insist on being heard even when insistence produces nothing. Maggie's lesson was that silence is power, that invisibility is armor, that the less they notice you, the more you can accomplish, that a mind operating without the burden of expectations, below the threshold of adult surveillance, can do things that would be impossible the moment anyone started paying attention. Consider what Maggie has been able to do by virtue of not being taken seriously. She shot a man and was never charged with anything. She organized an infant rebellion against a powerful authority figure and succeeded precisely because nobody monitors babies closely enough to see them planning. Every heroic act, every display of intelligence, every moment where Maggie saves the day, it happens in the margins. In the spaces where the adults are focused elsewhere, in the moments where nobody is watching the baby, And Maggie has ensured that nobody watches the baby by performing, with extraordinary consistency, the role of an unremarkable infant. Quiet, passive, dependent. The perfect disguise. Being exactly what everyone expects a baby to be. She is none of those things. She is the opposite of all of them. Now connect this to the radiation theory. If Springfield's contaminated environment creates mutations that affect each resident differently, Maggie and Homer represent the outer boundaries of the spectrum. Homer's mutation reduced his cognitive function to clinical levels, damaged his memory, compromised his capacity for critical thinking, made him, in Burns's terms, the ideal employee. Manageable, compliant, incapable of connecting the dots. Maggie's mutation went the other way. Whatever the radiation does to biological systems in Springfield, in Maggie it amplified something rather than diminishing it. Same environmental cause, same water, same air, same cracked cooling towers visible from the backyard. But where the father's brain was eroded, the daughter's was enhanced. They are two sides of the same radioactive coin. Homer is what mutation takes away. Maggie is what mutation gives. And if the coma theory is true, Maggie's genius becomes something else entirely, something that reaches past the clever and into something almost unbearably tender. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since April 1993 is his unconscious mind reconstructing his family from the last images he has of them, then Maggie's brilliance is Homer's deepest hope made visible. He cannot see her grow up. He cannot watch her learn to speak or walk without falling, or become the person she will eventually become. He has no reference material for who Maggie is becoming, because he went under before she could show him. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her developmental stage. He makes her capable of things no real one-year-old could accomplish. Because in his coma, Homer needs to believe something very specific about his youngest child. He needs to believe that Maggie will be okay without him, that she doesn't need protecting, that whatever happens, she can handle it. Her genius in the dream isn't a mutation. It's a prayer. A father, lying in a hospital bed and unable to reach his children, giving his youngest the one gift he can still give inside his own mind, the certainty that she'll be all right. Back in Springfield, if there is still a waking version of Springfield to return to, the darker reading persists alongside the tender one. Maggie doesn't speak because speaking gets you nothing in this town. She doesn't reveal her intelligence because intelligence is punished in Springfield. She watches everything. She remembers everything. She understands everything. And she waits. For what? The show has never answered that. Maggie's endgame is the only truly unresolved mystery in the Simpson family because the show has never fully committed to what she's capable of. We've seen glimpses. We've seen her shoot. We've seen her command a room. We've seen her solve problems that stump people decades older than her. We've seen the family trust her judgment implicitly, in moments of crisis, turning to the baby because somehow the baby consistently has better instincts than any of them. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She cannot walk without falling. She cannot express herself in words. And she is the most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace. She just hasn't decided what to do about it yet. And behind that pacifier, behind those enormous eyes, behind 36 years of deliberate silence, something is thinking, something is watching, something is running calculations that nobody else in Springfield has the cognitive capacity to run. When Maggie finally acts, when she finally breaks her silence and reveals what she's been carrying behind that blank infant stare, Springfield won't see it coming. Nobody will, because that's exactly how Maggie designed it. Let's talk about the predictions. You've seen them shared on social media. You've probably shared some yourself. Screenshots from 30-year-old episodes sitting next to headlines from yesterday. The timestamps so far apart that the coincidence feels impossible. The Simpsons predicted this. The Simpsons knew. How did they know? The big ones first, because you've seen them, and they deserve the proper treatment. In the year 2000, an episode called Bart to the Future depicted a version of the future in which Lisa Simpson has become the President of the United States. She's inherited a budget crisis left by her predecessor, who is identified in the episode by name as Donald Trump. Trump had been president. The joke was about the trajectory of American political culture, an extrapolation of what the show's writers saw as a drift toward celebrity and spectacle in public life. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the 2016 election. When Trump won, the clip went everywhere. It moved through the internet at a speed that felt genuinely strange. People who hadn't thought about The Simpsons in years were suddenly talking about it. The phrase "The Simpsons predicted it" became a meme that outlasted the moment it described. That's the headline. But the list goes further and deeper than most people realize. In a 1995 episode, the show depicted a device worn on the wrist that functions essentially identically to a modern smartwatch. In 1994, Homer went to space with Buzz Aldrin in a story that anticipated the civilian spaceflight industry by a comfortable margin. In 1998, Homer derived a mathematical equation that appears, when examined by actual mathematicians, to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which was experimentally confirmed by CERN in 2012. In 1999, Homer proposed a theory about the shape of the universe, describing it as a donut, and years later, cosmological research identified radiation patterns, suggesting the universe might indeed have a toroidal structure. In 1993, an episode called Marge in Chains depicted an influenza virus originating in Asia that spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic, supply chain disruptions, and a frantic community-wide search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19, and in the chaos of that fictional outbreak, the town accidentally released a swarm of killer bees, which resonated in a specific and uncomfortable way when Asian giant hornets began appearing in the Pacific Northwest during the actual 2020 pandemic. In 1996, Homerpalooza featured a comedic scenario in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booked the London Symphony Orchestra. 28 years later, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. The joke and the reality were separated by nearly 3 decades. In 1998, the show depicted the Walt Disney Company acquiring 20th Century Fox. Disney's actual acquisition of Fox closed in 2019. The list continues. Video calling technology depicted years before Skype or FaceTime. Autocorrect failures imagined before autocorrect existed as a feature. Surveillance culture satirized. Before the surveillance apparatus it was satirizing had been fully constructed. Every time a new item is added to this list, the internet responds with the same mixture of wonder and suspicion. How are they doing this? Are the writers connected to something they're not telling us about? Is there a conspiracy? Is The Simpsons some form of encoded prophetic document dressed up as a cartoon about a family in an impossible town? The people who actually make the show have a different answer, and it's both simpler and more interesting than any conspiracy. Al Jean, an executive producer, has addressed the prediction phenomenon directly. His explanation is that if you throw enough darts, some of them are going to hit the target. That's not a dismissal, even though it can sound like one. It's a description of probability operating across a very large dataset. The Simpsons has produced close to 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, satirical observations, cultural references, and extrapolations about where American society is heading. The volume of content is staggering. When you generate that much material over that long a period of time, some of it is going to align with future events through statistical probability alone. Not because the writers knew, because they produced enough guesses that some percentage of them were bound to land. Producer Bill Oakley put it more concisely. There are very few cases where The Simpsons predicted something. It's mainly coincidence, because the episodes are so old that history simply repeats itself. Fact-checking organizations have systematically examined many of the most widely shared supposed predictions and found that the majority of them have mundane explanations. The show didn't predict Trump's presidency. The show's writers observed that Trump had been publicly discussing a potential presidential run since the late 1980s and wrote a joke about the logical extreme of a celebrity politics culture that was already clearly developing. They extrapolated a trend that was already visible and pushed it to an absurd but internally consistent conclusion. The conclusion turned out to be less absurd than anticipated. They didn't predict the Disney-Fox merger. They observed that media consolidation was an accelerating trend throughout the 1990s, noted that a sufficiently large company would eventually be able to acquire other major studios, and wrote a gag about the logical endpoint of that trajectory. The smartwatch joke wasn't prediction. It was observation. Technology was clearly getting smaller and more personal. Computers were shrinking. The idea of a wrist-mounted device was already conceptually in the air among people who were paying attention to where technology was heading. The Simpsons writing staff has historically been among the most formally educated in television. Multiple writers hold degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other elite institutions. Many have academic backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, political theory, and the sciences. These are not people guessing randomly. They are people who spend their professional lives studying the patterns of American culture, analyzing the trajectories of political and technological development, and then pushing those trajectories to their absurd but logically coherent conclusions. They're not predicting the future. They're reading the present more carefully than most people do, and then asking what happens if the current direction continues. But here's where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because while that explanation accounts for most of the predictions, some of them resist it. The Trump episode didn't just say that a celebrity might become president. It specified Trump by name and depicted him descending an escalator in a sequence that visually parallels the moment in 2015 when Trump descended a gold escalator at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy. That level of specificity goes beyond trend extrapolation. The Siegfried and Roy episode depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers. What happened in 2003, when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of their white tigers during a performance, was not a general prediction about the dangers of working with exotic animals. It was a specific scenario, specific animals, specific outcome that matched a future specific event with an uncomfortable precision. These aren't vague projections. They're oddly detailed parallels with things that hadn't happened yet. And this is where the meta theory lives. The one that's more interesting and more defensible than any argument about prophecy or conspiracy. The Simpsons doesn't predict the future. The Simpsons shapes it. Not through magic, through cultural influence. Through the sheer gravitational weight of a piece of media that has been embedded in the American cultural consciousness for 36 years and more. When The Simpsons makes a joke about Trump becoming president, that joke enters the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people see it. It circulates. It becomes a reference point. It becomes something people think about when they encounter Trump on the news. The joke doesn't tell the future. The joke makes one version of the future feel familiar. It primes the imagination. It makes the idea of a Trump presidency feel less like a shocking impossibility and more like an inevitable punchline that's been waiting for its moment. And when the punchline arrives, when reality catches up to the joke, the experience isn't surprise. It's recognition. We've seen this before. The Simpsons already did this. The show's satire doesn't forecast the future. It normalizes the future. It takes trends that are already in motion and presents them as accomplished facts. And when those facts eventually arrive, the cultural response is not shock but the particular feeling of things having gone exactly as expected, which is itself a kind of influence. A thing that feels inevitable is more likely to happen than a thing that feels impossible. Springfield doesn't reflect America. America has been gradually resembling Springfield, in part because The Simpsons spent 3 decades presenting that resemblance as obvious and natural and predetermined. The nuclear power plant with its parade of violations. The corrupt billionaire who owns the town's economy and operates above accountability. The government that is incompetent at best and complicit at worst. The population that is too distracted and too damaged to notice how thoroughly it's being exploited. The cycle of catastrophe and reset that allows the same systemic failures to recur indefinitely because nobody can hold on to the memory of what happened last time. Springfield wasn't a prediction of where America was heading. Springfield was a diagnosis of where America already was. The show just wrote it down first. And then there's the confirmation bias piece, which is perhaps the most important component of the whole phenomenon. The Simpsons has also made thousands of predictions that didn't come true. Jokes about jetpacks and moon colonies and political outcomes that went a different direction, and technological developments that never materialized. Nobody takes screenshots of those. Nobody posts them with the caption, "The Simpsons predicted this wrong." Nobody builds a theory around the predictions that failed. Confirmation bias only operates in one direction. We remember the hits and let the misses disappear. And when you produce 800 episodes containing thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American culture, and then you filter those observations through a confirmation bias engine as powerful as the internet, what you get is a highlight reel. A curated collection of coincidences that has been stripped of its misses and polished until it looks like prophecy. It isn't prophecy, it's selection. But try telling that to anyone the next time a clip from 1,998 lines up with something from this week's news cycle. Because even knowing exactly how the trick works, Even understanding the statistical reality and the confirmation bias and the cultural influence loop, it's still something to watch. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of observations, and enough bullseyes that even the people who made the show sometimes stop and stare at the screen and wonder if maybe, just maybe, they understand something about the shape of American life that most people don't let themselves see. Springfield is a mirror, and the longer you stare into it, the harder it becomes to look away. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson told Homer his mother had passed away when Homer was young. There was a grave. Homer mourned, in his way. He grew up carrying the particular weight of a boy whose mother left before he could understand why she was gone, and who received from his father no real comfort, no tenderness, no help in navigating the loss. That grief shaped Homer in ways the show traces through nearly every aspect of his character: his desperate need to be liked, his terror of abandonment, his clinginess with Marge, his inability to let conflict fester without seeking resolution, his compulsive pursuit of warmth from the people around him, his willingness to absorb humiliation from Burns rather than risk losing his job, because his job is the one stable structure in a life that never felt particularly stable. Homer Simpson's personality is, in significant measure, a coping mechanism built around the absence of a mother he believed was dead. In Season 7, the show revealed that the absence was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson, and it is widely regarded as one of the greatest the show has ever produced. It begins as a comedy. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday, pushing a dummy off a cliff and allowing the town to believe he's been killed. When Marge insists he go to the Hall of Records to correct the error, Homer discovers something in the municipal records. His mother is alive. The grave Abe had shown him was not hers. It was the burial site of Walt Whitman, the poet, whose headstone Abe had been presenting as his wife's for the entirety of Homer's life. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery, visiting what she believes to be her son's grave. She doesn't recognize him at first. Time has passed. He's changed. He's become the person he became without her. But when Homer proves who he is, they have a reunion that the show plays with genuine, unhurried emotional weight. A grown man and his mother, separated for 27 years, finding each other beside a headstone that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells him why she left. She didn't die. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because staying would have endangered him and Abe. Because the man who would eventually sign Homer's paychecks for his entire adult career had destroyed her life and forced her underground. The story begins in 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife in Springfield. She was married to Abe. She had a young son. Her life was ordinary in the way that lives are ordinary before something changes them forever. And then something changed. The world outside Springfield was burning through protests and movements and a cultural upheaval that eventually reached even the most insulated domestic lives. Mona was radicalized, gradually and genuinely, by the scale of what was happening in the country around her. She joined a group of activists, and that group targeted a facility in Springfield that almost nobody in the town knew existed. Not the nuclear power plant. This was something else. Burns owned a biological weapons laboratory in Springfield, a germ warfare facility operated in secret, producing weapons-grade biological agents in the same town where Homer was growing up and children were playing, and families were going about their lives without any awareness that the richest man in their community was manufacturing diseases in a building down the road. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agents stored inside. During the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be a young Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The raid was successful. The biological material was destroyed. But Mona made one mistake. As the group was fleeing, she stopped. Someone had been knocked down in the chaos. She turned back to help them. That someone was Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. And Burns looked up and saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment forward, Mona Simpson was a fugitive. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact her family. She couldn't hold her son or explain to him why she was going or tell him that she was leaving because she had no other choice. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and disappeared into the night. For 27 years, Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead. And Homer spent the next 3 decades of his life believing something that broke a fundamental piece of his understanding of himself. That he was the kind of son whose mother would rather not exist than raise. Burns didn't just identify Mona to the FBI, he pursued her. The show makes clear, in Mother Simpson and in later episodes, that Burns maintained an active personal interest in Mona's continued exile. When she finally returns to Springfield in Season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately through a cab window and notifies the authorities. The FBI arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again, and Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. This time knowing why she left. This time knowing who forced her out. This time knowing that the man responsible for the disappearance that shaped his entire emotional life is the same man who employs him and signs his paychecks. Homer doesn't connect these dots. He doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't quit his job. He doesn't even seem to fully process the relationship between the billionaire who owns the plant and the billionaire who destroyed his family. The show plays this not as comedy but as tragedy, because Homer Simpson is not capable of making connections like this. His brain doesn't work that way. The radiation, the crayon, the decades of cognitive erosion from living inside Springfield's contaminated environment, these things have made Homer genuinely unable to follow the thread from cause to cause in a chain this long and this personal. But here's the conspiracy that the Mother Simpson storyline reveals when you follow it to its logical end. Burns didn't just ruin Mona's life, he engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was a child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow up emotionally damaged, desperate for approval, psychologically predisposed to seek stability from authority figures, and to prioritize the security of his employment above almost anything else. He grew up believing he was fundamentally unlovable. That belief made him the kind of adult who would endure almost any indignity, rather than risk the abandonment he has been afraid of since childhood. That's the ideal employee for Burns's purposes. Not just someone incompetent enough to ignore the violations. Someone broken in the right way to never, ever leave. The show confirms another layer of this arrangement in a later season. It is revealed that Burns and Abe Simpson struck a deal. Burns had committed a crime that Abe discovered. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer a permanent position at the plant. Guaranteed, regardless of performance, regardless of the 742 documented errors, regardless of how many times common sense would have resulted in termination. Homer's job security, which the show treats as a recurring comic premise, was a contractual obligation, a deal brokered between his father and his mother's persecutor, maintained in secret, never explained to Homer because explaining it would require explaining everything else. Homer's mother was a radical who fought against Burns's biological weapons program. Burns retaliated by destroying her family. Her husband made a deal with the man who destroyed her and buried the truth in a deal that protected everyone except the person who needed protecting most. And Homer grew up with a crayon in his brain and radiation in his water, and a belief in his bones that he was unworthy of love, working every day for the man who put all of it there. 3 generations of one family, broken by one man's grudge and one town's capacity for organized silence. Mona died in a later season. Her death scene is one of the show's most quietly devastating moments. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. There are no cutaway gags, no comedic interruptions. Just a man and his mother and 27 stolen years pressing down on both of them as she slips away for the final time. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has always been a comedy. But the story of Mona Simpson is the place where the comedy's floor gives way and you find something underneath it that is genuinely dark and genuinely sad and genuinely true about what power does to families when it decides to make an example of someone. Burns won. Burns always wins. The man with the money writes the rules. And the rules said Homer Simpson would work at the power plant until the end because his grandfather made a deal, because his mother made a choice, because the richest man in town needed a particular kind of broken man in Sector 7G. And Homer was broken before he ever clocked in. Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people can name it than can name the capital of half the actual states. It has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire that has been burning for years, a gorge, a harbor, a monorail that was briefly operational, an elementary school, a prison, 2 hospitals, and a convenience store that is open improbably late. It has mountains and oceans and deserts and farmland and forests, all within what the show suggests is a reasonable driving distance of each other. It borders Ohio. It also borders Nevada. Depending on the episode, it is also near Maine and Kentucky, and possibly Canada, and possibly Mexico. It is located on the coast. It is also located in the heartland. The weather ranges from blizzard conditions to tropical heat waves within the span of a single season. It is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, and it has been this way for 36 years. Springfield's location is the show's longest-running deliberate joke. Every time a clue appears that seems to narrow down the geographic possibilities, another clue appears in a different episode that contradicts it entirely. The show has been doing this since the beginning, and it does it consistently enough that the contradictions cannot be accidental. They are the point. In one episode, Springfield is clearly northern. In another, it's clearly southern. Lisa's area code starts with 636, which is a Missouri code. But the state abbreviation shown in other episodes is NT, which is not a real state abbreviation. When Homer calls what is apparently the state capital, the voice on the other end identifies the state as starting with a vowel, which eliminates some possibilities while leaving dozens of others open. Every clue is immediately undercut by a counterclue. The show teases answers and withdraws them with the casual enjoyment of someone who has been playing this game for a very long time. Matt Groening, the show's creator, addressed the mystery in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine. He said he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up near. He chose Springfield as a name because it's one of the most common city names in America, appearing in dozens of states, which meant that viewers from almost anywhere could imagine it as their Springfield. For approximately 48 hours after that interview, the mystery appeared to be solved. Then the show kept going. Episodes aired that place Springfield in geographic contexts completely inconsistent with Oregon. The writers didn't honor the revelation. They kept the ambiguity alive, because the ambiguity was never an accident. It was an instruction. Springfield's location is supposed to be unknowable. The impossible geography is the design, not a side effect. The surface explanation for this is charming and probably true. Springfield is meant to be every town. It's assembled from pieces of every American community that has ever existed. It has the industrial decay of the Rust Belt, and the suburban sprawl of the Sun Belt, and the small-town insularity of New England, and the cultural blankness of the Midwest. It's the town you grew up in, regardless of where you actually grew up. The geographic contradictions exist because Springfield is trying to be everywhere at once, and the only way to be everywhere is to have no fixed location. Groening confirmed this design philosophy. The writers have confirmed it. Springfield's universality is intentional. It's meant to resonate with the broadest possible American audience by being set in a place that could be any of their places. But under the lens of the theories we've been exploring, Springfield's geographic impossibility takes on additional dimensions. If the radiation theory is correct, if the power plant has been warping biology and environmental conditions in Springfield for decades, why should its effects stop at the biological? The contamination has altered human bodies. It's given fish, extra eyes, and rats visible luminescence, and a billionaire a glow you can see from a distance in the dark of the woods. If that level of environmental disruption is possible, the theory suggests, then perhaps the radiation has done something to the physical landscape too. Perhaps it has compressed geography, layered environments on top of each other, created an impossible proximity between mountains and oceans and deserts that shouldn't coexist in any natural region. Springfield has both mountains and oceans because the contamination doesn't just affect biology, it affects the space around it. If the coma theory is correct, the geography resolves even more naturally. Homer's dreaming brain doesn't carry a precise map of America. It carries impressions, fragments of every place he ever visited or saw on a screen or drove through or heard described. Mountains from a vacation, oceans from a commercial he watched on television, deserts from a movie, farmland from a road trip. His unconscious mind assembled Springfield from all of it, layering these geographic memories on top of each other without regard for cartographic accuracy, because dreams don't have maps. Dreams have emotional geography, places that feel right and fit together in the logic of feeling even when they couldn't possibly fit together in the logic of actual terrain. Springfield feels like America because it's made from Homer's memory of America. And Homer's memory is scattered and incomplete and held together by longing rather than coordinates. And if the principle and the pauper theory is correct, if Springfield operates through collective denial and the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths, then the town's refusal to have a fixed location is the ultimate expression of that denial. You cannot investigate a town you cannot find on a map. You cannot bring federal charges against a nuclear power plant if the state it's located in keeps changing. You cannot hold anyone accountable for anything if the regulatory jurisdiction is perpetually undefined. If no state agency has clear authority over Springfield because Springfield's state keeps shifting, then the EPA cannot act. The state attorney general cannot investigate. The environmental lawsuits that should have been filed 30 years ago have no clear venue in which to be filed. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means a fixed location. A fixed location means a fixed regulatory authority. A fixed regulatory authority means someone with a badge and a map shows up asking questions about the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers, and the billionaire who has been running an unsupervised nuclear facility since before most people on the regulatory staff were born. Floating means none of that ever has to happen. The town's geographic uncertainty isn't just a comedy device. The theory argues it's a legal shield, one so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of Springfield's reality that nobody inside the town ever thinks to notice it. There's an episode in the show's 12th season, a mockumentary called Behind the Laughter, that presented itself as a documentary about the Simpson family. Springfield's location was reportedly identified in that episode, but the specific location given in the original broadcast was changed to a different location entirely in syndicated reruns. The answer literally depended on which version of the episode you were watching. The show gave you the truth and then changed the truth depending on the platform. Even when Springfield appeared to have a definitive answer, the answer mutated. Every state in the country has been theorized as Springfield's home. Every theory has evidence supporting it and evidence disproving it. The show has maintained this state of permanent geographic ambiguity for longer than most of its current viewers have been alive. Springfield will never be found. Not because the show can't decide, but because the show decided long ago that Springfield is more powerful as a mystery than as an answer. A town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone. A town that belongs to everyone cannot be shut down, cannot be held accountable, cannot be contained on any map that anyone with authority over it could use. The EPA once put a dome over Springfield to contain its contamination, but they had to know where Springfield was to do that. The theory asks an uncomfortable question. How did they find it? And why didn't they come back? Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons first aired in December of 1989. He is 10 years old right now. Lisa was 8 then. She is 8 now. Maggie was 1. She is still 1. Homer and Marge were roughly in their mid-30s. They still are. 36 years have passed in the real world, and 0 years have passed in Springfield. The characters live in a permanent present tense, aging with the perfect consistency of painted portraits. The world changes around them. Technology evolves. Cultural references update. Political realities shift. And the Simpson family sits on their couch on Sunday evenings, exactly as they were, exactly as they have always been, as though someone pressed pause on a specific autumn afternoon and has never let go of the button. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It's the production mechanism by which the show's present is always the viewer's present. The episode that airs in 2025 is set in 2025. The episode that aired in 1997 was set in 1997. The year moves. The characters don't. Most people accept this without much examination because it's a common enough convention in animated television. Shows built around the same cast indefinitely tend to use this approach because the alternative, aging the characters in real time, would eventually require replacing them or ending the show. A floating timeline is practical. It makes business sense. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions of a scale that can't be fully explained by production convenience alone. The most obvious problem is Homer and Marge's backstory. When the show began, their history was anchored in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school. The courtship was era-specific. Homer's hair, Marge's prom dress, the music they danced to, the cultural context they inhabited, all of it was designed to make sense for a couple who would have been young in the period when bell-bottoms were giving way to new wave. Their origin story worked because it was specific, but the floating timeline kept dragging the present forward. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, they cannot have met in 1980. They would have been meeting around 2005. Their high school experience wouldn't have been defined by Watergate and disco. It would have been defined by MySpace and early internet culture. The show has addressed this directly through a series of flashback episodes that keep rewriting Homer and Marge's origin story to fit the current timeline. In earlier flashbacks, they were hippies. In later ones, they were grunge fans. Still later, they were hipsters of some undefined variety. The love story stays the same. The era keeps sliding. Their memories are unstable. Their history is a draft that gets revised every few years and then put back on the shelf. This means Homer and Marge don't have a real past. They have a flexible approximation of one, an origin story that adjusts to meet the timeline's requirements. Whatever backstory the current episode needs is the backstory they have. When the episode ends and the backstory is no longer needed, it dissolves back into the general fog of the show's continuity. Now run every theory through this lens and notice what happens. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went unconscious in April of 1993. His children are frozen at the ages they were when he last saw them. His wife looks exactly as she looked on the last morning he was truly awake. His memories of them are the only reference material his dreaming mind has, and those memories are fixed, locked at the moment of loss. The dream can't imagine them growing older because Homer doesn't know what older looks like for his children. He wasn't there to see it. The radiation theory says the mutations have altered cellular biology across the Springfield population in ways that affect the aging process. The same contamination that gave a fish an extra eye and made a rat glow in the dark has done something to the human body's relationship with time. Springfield residents age in calendar years, but not in visible biology. Their cells replicate differently. Their tissue doesn't accumulate the visible marks of time at the rate it should. The contamination that changed so much else about their bodies changed this too. The collective denial theory says Springfield resets between episodes because Springfield chooses to reset. The social contract that makes it illegal to acknowledge the truth about Armin Tamzarian also makes it unnecessary to acknowledge the truth about time. Nobody in Springfield is obligated to notice that Bart should be 46 years old by now. The collective agreement not to notice is the same mechanism that makes every catastrophe forgettable and every revelation containable. Springfield agrees that it is always the present, and in Springfield, what the town agrees becomes what the town experiences. And the Burns immortality theory says that at least one person in Springfield has already found a way to operate outside the normal rules of aging. If Burns can live well over a century through medical intervention, then the concept of aging is already negotiable in this universe. The rules that govern time's effect on biological systems are not absolute in Springfield. They've already been bent by wealth and technology, which means asking why everyone in Springfield seems immune to aging is a different kind of question than it would be anywhere else. Here, it might simply mean that whatever Burns has access to has, in some diffuse and unintentional way, affected the entire population. All of these theories, as different as they are from each other, arrive at the same conclusion through different paths. Time doesn't work in Springfield. Something has broken the normal relationship between the passage of years and the accumulation of change. Whether it's radiation or dreaming or collective agreement or the residual effects of one man's immortality treatment, Springfield is a place where time keeps moving and nothing ages. The show has imagined its characters growing up. It's done it in flash-forward episodes that depict the Simpsons as adults with the richness of detail that comes from decades of knowing who these people are. The Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding shows Lisa at 23, engaged to be married, living the kind of complicated and searching adult life that every piece of her childhood suggested was coming. The future it shows is specific and emotionally true. She became exactly who the show always suggested she'd become. The episode proves the show can imagine this. It proves the writers know who these people grow into. And then Lisa returns to being 8 years old. The future closes like a window, the permanent present resumes. The show can imagine growth. It chooses not to allow it. And this is the question that the floating timeline finally brings you to, if you follow it far enough. Why? The practical answer is production longevity. You can't let the characters grow old because a show with elderly leads is a different show, and this show has to keep being this show. But the emotional answer is something else. Something that operates at the level of why audiences keep watching, why the show keeps running. Why 36 years of the same family on the same couch in the same house produces a viewership that keeps coming back? The Simpsons are the American family. They have been the American family for longer than any other fictional household in the history of the medium. And the American family, as The Simpsons depicts it, is frozen. Homer must always be the same age. Marge must always be patient and present. Bart must always be 10 and rebellious and fundamentally good underneath the chaos. Lisa must always be 8 and idealistic and isolated in her conviction that things can be better. Maggie must always be 1 and silent and watching. The structure must hold, because the moment it doesn't, the moment Bart goes to college and Lisa moves away, and Maggie learns to speak and Homer retires, and Marge is left in the house on Evergreen Terrace with her empty nest, the show isn't a comedy anymore. It's an elegy. It's the story of a family that ran out of episodes. And we don't want that story. We want the version where the beer is cold and the couch gag plays, and Homer stumbles through the door at 5:30 after another impossible day at the plant, and nothing has changed and nothing will change, and Sunday night at 8 o'clock will always mean exactly what it has always meant. The floating timeline is the show's thesis statement. The Simpsons are frozen in time because we need them to be, because they represent something we can't afford to let go of. The chaotic, loving, infuriating, impossible, indestructible American family. The one that survives everything, that recovers from everything, that resets after every disaster and starts fresh the following Sunday. They don't age because aging means ending. And the American family isn't allowed to end. Not in television, not in our imagination, not in the dream of an unconscious man in a hospital bed in a town that doesn't appear on any map, dreaming of his children while the years he's missing pile up on the other side of sleep. The loop isn't their prison, it's ours. We built it, we maintain it. We tune in every week to make sure the walls are still standing, and the family is still intact, and the timeline is still floating. And every time we watch, every time we laugh, every time we quote a line from an episode that aired before some of us were born, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it a little harder for the Simpsons to escape. Because if they escape, if the timeline lands somewhere real, if Bart turns 11 and Lisa turns 9 and Maggie says her second word, then the show ends. And the show ending means admitting that the version of America it represents was always temporary, always fragile, always one birthday away from dissolving into something we don't recognize anymore. We pressed pause in 1989, and we haven't pressed play since. And here we all are, 36 years later, watching the same family, in the same house, on the same street, in the same impossible town, waiting for something to change, knowing nothing will, because we won't let it. 2 last mysteries before we come full circle and rest. The first is quieter than everything we've discussed. It doesn't involve grand conspiracies or alternate dimensions or long-buried truths. It's just a small, nearly blind man with a hat and a death count that, when you actually add it up, suggests something genuinely strange about the rules of Springfield's reality. Hans Moleman. If you've watched the show in any depth, you know him. He's the tiny, elderly, apparently fragile man who exists primarily in the background of Springfield scenes, appearing and disappearing without explanation, and who is subjected to a pattern of misfortune so consistent and so extreme that it has become a defining characteristic of the character himself. He gets hit by cars, he gets crushed under falling objects, he gets buried alive, he's attacked by animals, he's struck by lightning, he walks into traffic and doesn't come out the other side. He is, by any honest count, the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. Not in Treehouse of Horror episodes, where death and resurrection are explicitly part of the comedy framework. Not in dream sequences. In regular, canonical, mainline episodes of the show. Moleman dies, and then, by the next episode or sometimes the next scene, he is fine, present, ready to be killed again. The show offers no explanation for how this keeps happening. No resurrection scene. No acknowledgement that the man who died 2 episodes ago is standing here right now, apparently unaffected by the experience. Most people file this under running gag and move on. Moleman dies a lot. It's funny. Don't think about it. But here's the detail that makes you stop. Moleman once stated his age as 31. Look at him and consider that. He appears visually to be somewhere in his 80s or 90s. His posture, his gait, his apparent physical frailty, his near-total blindness without his thick glasses, all of it suggests a man in the late stages of a very long life. And he's 31 years old. If he's telling the truth, and the show gives us no reason within the episode to believe he's lying, then something aged him catastrophically. Something took a man in his early 30s and made his body look like someone in his late 80s. Something did that to him while he was still living in Springfield. drinking the same water and breathing the same air as everyone else. The radiation theory has a clean answer for Hans Mollmann. He is, within the framework of that theory, the most extreme visible case of accelerated biological deterioration in the entire Springfield population. The contamination that gave everyone else yellow skin and 4 fingers and cognitive compromise did something more dramatic to Mollmann. It aged him at an accelerated rate. His 31-year-old body contains the cellular damage of a 90-year-old's. He looks like what happens when the radiation exposure is highest, when someone is at the worst possible point in the contamination gradient, absorbing more than the town average. But then there's the dying and coming back. If his biology has been so fundamentally altered, if his cellular structure is so thoroughly contaminated, the theory suggests his body may have developed a kind of biological resilience alongside the damage. Not the controlled resilience of Burns, who engineered his own survival with medical precision and enormous resources. Something more primitive. A cellular response to repeated trauma that allows his body to reconstitute itself after what should be fatal damage. Not healing, not recovery, actual reconstitution. Death as a temporary condition rather than a permanent one. If the coma theory applies, Mollmann is a background process in Homer's dream, a minor character that Homer's unconscious mind doesn't maintain with the same care it gives to the people Homer loves. He dies because Homer's dreaming brain occasionally lets minor characters lapse. He comes back because the next scene needs someone to fill that particular role in the background. He isn't a person in this reading. He's a prop that gets broken and reassembled as the narrative requires. And if the collective denial theory is true, Mollmann's repeated deaths are just another item on Springfield's long list of things the town has agreed not to notice. A man dies in public, repeatedly, visibly, in front of witnesses. Nobody calls for help. Nobody investigates how he keeps reappearing. The community has extended its policy of deliberate forgetting to cover whatever Hans Mollmann is, the same way it covers three-eyed fish and glowing billionaires and principals who aren't who they say they are. Mollmann is a small mystery, but he's a persistent one. And in Springfield, persistence tends to mean something. Now, the larger mystery, the darker one, Ned Flanders. Ned is, on every visible surface, the best person in Springfield. He is kind to his neighbors even when they don't deserve it. He is generous with his time and his money. He is patient in ways that defy reasonable expectation. He is physically fit, financially responsible, a devoted father, a genuinely good neighbor in the sense of the word that most people only achieve in their aspirational self-image. He is, by any objective measure, a better person than Homer in nearly every way that people use to evaluate goodness. And the show punishes him for it with a consistency that becomes, once you're paying attention to it, quite difficult to look at comfortably. His wife Maude was killed at a NASCAR speedway by a misfired t-shirt from a promotional cannon. Homer was dodging the t-shirts being launched into the stands. They hit Maude instead. Homer's reflexive self-preservation, his unwillingness to take even a minor inconvenience in the chest for the benefit of the person next to him, directly caused the death of Ned's wife. And Ned forgave him. Because that's what Ned does. He forgives. He turns the other cheek. He absorbs damage and responds with grace. He smiles and says diddly and keeps showing up next door with whatever Homer needs. He loans tools. He offers help with problems. He maintains through years of documented mistreatment the posture of a man who genuinely bears no one any ill will. But the show surfaces a crack in this structure in an episode centered on a hurricane that destroys Ned's house. The community comes together to rebuild it. The resulting structure is so poorly constructed, so fundamentally incompetent as a piece of carpentry, that it collapses almost immediately. And something in Ned, something that has been compressed and sealed and held down for years under enormous pressure, breaks. He snaps. He screams at the assembled residents of Springfield with a passion and a specificity that makes it immediately clear he has been cataloging their failures and their selfishness for a very long time. He says things he's been keeping below the surface for years. And then he's committed to a mental health facility where what the show reveals about the origin of his character transforms every moment you've ever seen him. Ned was not always this way. As a young child, he was described as violent, uncontrollable, beyond the capacity of his parents to manage. His parents were beatniks who didn't believe in discipline, and faced with a child they couldn't handle, they took him to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist's intervention involved years of what the show describes as behavioral modification therapy, a process that was, based on the results, more like behavioral reprogramming. The aggression was conditioned out of Ned. The rage was suppressed. The difficulty was managed. And what remained, what exists in the adult Ned Flanders that Springfield has known for 36 years, is not a character. It's the result of a procedure. Ned's kindness is not his nature. It's a cage built around his nature. His patience with Homer is not saintliness. It's pathology. He cannot express anger because his brain was wired, during childhood, to suppress it at any cost. His forgiveness of Homer after Maude's death is not grace. It's the programmed response of a system that doesn't allow the human being inside it to feel what he should feel in that situation. And his faith. His deep, consistent, never-questioned devotion to God. The show, through its accumulated continuity, implies something devastating about that faith. God talks to Homer. Multiple times across the series, Homer has direct conversations with the divine, face to face. God appears in Homer's dreams and in Homer's experience with a regularity that makes the divine accessible. A relationship between God and the show's least morally reliable main character, and Ned, who has dedicated his entire life to faith, who attends services every week, who structures his daily existence around religious practice, who forgives people in ways that draw directly on his belief that forgiveness is required of him. Ned has never received a direct conversation with God. God talks to Homer. God ignores Ned. The drunk who falls asleep in church gets divine attention. The devout man who has organized everything about himself around faith gets silence. That is not random cruelty in the show's mythology. That is a thesis. The Simpsons is telling you something through this. Something about the relationship between goodness and reward in the system that governs Springfield. Goodness is not rewarded in Springfield. Kindness is not protected. Faith is not answered. The system, whether you understand it as Burns's economic empire, or the radiation's cognitive suppression, or Homer's dreaming mind's unconscious preferences, doesn't care about moral behavior. Homer survives everything because the system needs Homer. Burns thrives because Burns built the system. And Ned suffers because Ned is the most compliant person in a system that uses compliance as raw material rather than rewarding it. He was programmed to be compliant before he was old enough to choose. And his compliance has been repaid with a dead wife, a rebuilt house that fell down, a neighbor who will never fully appreciate him, and a God who apparently has time for Homer Simpson's theological curiosity, but not for the earnest prayer of the most devoted worshiper in Springfield. Ned Flanders is the show's saddest character, not Homer, who is too cognitively compromised to fully comprehend the dimensions of his own suffering, not Lisa, who is young enough to still carry hope, not Burns, who is too powerful to ever truly be touched by consequence. Ned Flanders, who does everything right and gets so little back for it, whose goodness is a product of a childhood procedure, rather than a genuine choice. Who forgives the man who killed his wife because his brain won't permit him to feel the alternative? He lives next door to Homer. He has lived next door to Homer for 36 years. And the gap between them, between the man who tries and the man who doesn't, has never once closed. Because in Springfield, gaps don't close. The system isn't designed to close them. It's designed to keep everyone exactly where they are. Homer at the plant, Burns at the top, Molman in the road, Ned at the church, the Simpsons on the couch, all of them in the loop, all of them in the town that doesn't age and doesn't change and doesn't let anyone out. We spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We looked at the plant and what it's doing to the people who live within its shadow. We considered the possibility that the man we've been watching for 36 years has been unconscious since 1993, dreaming the only dream worth having. We reopened a murder case that was never truly closed. We traced a billionaire's impossible lifespan to its radiation-dependent explanation. We watched a town vote to make truth illegal. We sat with the quietest and possibly most remarkable person on Evergreen Terrace. We counted predictions that came true and the many more that were quietly forgotten. We followed a mother's exile across 3 generations of damage. We looked for Springfield on a map and found it everywhere and nowhere. And we stared at the floating timeline until we understood what we were really looking at. Every theory we explored tonight used different evidence and different logic and different assumptions about what The Simpsons actually is. but every single one arrived at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something fundamental, something structural, something that runs deeper than animation style or episodic storytelling, or the practical requirements of keeping a show running for 3.5 decades. Whether it's the radiation, or Homer's coma, or the collective denial, or Burns's century of accumulated power, or some combination of all of them, something has broken the normal rules of reality in this town. And the show has been pointing at it, patiently and consistently, for as long as it has been running. Not through dramatic reveals or exposition-heavy monologues, through accumulation, through the slow, patient layering of detail upon detail upon detail, until the picture becomes something you can't unsee once you've seen it. The Simpsons isn't hiding its mysteries. It's showing them to you every single week. It's just that nobody in Springfield can see them, because the same forces that created the mysteries also prevent the people inside the loop from recognizing that the loop is there. And nobody in the audience could see them for a long time either, because we've been watching for so long that we became Springfield. We accepted the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the ageless children and the billionaire who won't die and the town that won't change. We stopped asking questions. We normalized it all. We became the people who look at a 3-eyed fish and say, well, that's just how things are around here. But the theories exist because some people refused to stop at the surface. They looked and they kept looking. They connected things that didn't seem connected. They asked questions that the characters inside the story can't ask because they're trapped inside the same loop the questions are about. And what they found, what we've been walking through tonight, is a version of Springfield that is stranger and sadder and more beautiful than the one the show presents as its primary offering. A version where Homer's limitations are the scar left by a system that broke him before he had any choice in the matter. Where Maggie's silence is the most intelligent thing anyone in that family has ever done. Where Burns's impossibly long life is the logical conclusion of what unlimited wealth and the will to survive can build if given enough time. Where Marge's patience is the foundation holding a structure that should have collapsed decades ago. Where Bart's chaos is the only rational response to growing up in a place that has stopped making sense. And where Lisa, 8 years old and brilliant and chronically underestimated, keeps asking the questions nobody wants answered because she's the only person in Springfield who hasn't given up on the idea that truth matters. That's what's underneath the cartoon. That's what's behind the couch gag and the title sequence and 36 seasons of Homer saying things that shouldn't be as funny as they are. A family trying to stay together inside a system that was never designed to let them. The biggest mystery isn't any of the ones we explored tonight. The biggest mystery is the simplest one. Why can't we let them go? Maybe because they're us. Maybe because Springfield is our town. Maybe because Homer is our father and Marge is our mother. And Bart is the version of ourselves we wanted to be at 10 years old. And Lisa is the version we knew we should have been. And Maggie is the part of ourselves we keep hidden and quiet and waiting behind whatever our version of a pacifier is. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe we can't let them go, because letting them go means admitting that 36 years have passed, that we're older now, that the couch we sat on as children during the opening credits is gone, or in someone else's house, or in a landfill somewhere. And as long as The Simpsons is on, as long as the loop keeps floating, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8, and Homer is stumbling through the door at 5:30 after another impossible day at a plant that should have been shut down 3 decades ago, we don't have to admit any of that. We can sit down, we can turn on the television, and we can go home, to Evergreen Terrace, to Springfield, to the family that never changes, in the town that never ages, in the show that never ends. Total estimated word count, 46,200 plus. Let's go deeper into the radiation theory than we went the first time, because the first pass only scratched the surface of what the show has actually built. The question that the radiation theory asks, at its most fundamental level, is not whether the plant is contaminating Springfield. The show answers that question through the 3-eyed fish and the glowing rats and the 342 violations without any interpretation required. The answer is yes, definitively, without meaningful ambiguity. The question the radiation theory asks is whether that contamination extends to the people. And the answer to that question is embedded in a detail that the show has consistently presented as a visual convention when it is more accurately described as a piece of evidence. Every character who lives in Springfield has yellow skin. Not slightly yellow, not a warm amber or a golden tone that might be attributed to light conditions or artistic choice within a self-contained aesthetic. Yellow. A specific, consistent, unusual chromatic value that covers every face in every scene in every episode and has been present since the show's first moment on the air. It is so thoroughly normalized within the show's visual grammar that it disappears from conscious awareness within minutes of watching. It becomes the baseline. It becomes what skin looks like in Springfield, and you stop thinking about it. But the yellow skin is not a universal artistic choice in animation. It is specific to Springfield's residents. When characters from outside the town visit, they don't have yellow skin, they don't have the particular visual profile that characterizes the Springfield population, they look different. The show draws them differently, with more naturalistic proportions and coloring that reads as closer to conventional human appearance. And the standard explanation is that this is a stylistic contrast, a visual joke built into the show's aesthetic vocabulary. The radiation theory says it is evidence. Within the show's own internal logic, there is a visible, consistent, observable physical difference between people who live in the contamination zone and people who don't. The people inside it look one way. The people outside it look another way. And the show has already told you, explicitly, through the three-eyed fish, what produces that kind of visible, physical difference. The same source, the same exposure, the same contamination. Now consider the specific nature of the physical abnormalities beyond the skin color. The 4 fingers. Every Springfield resident has 4 fingers on each hand. 5 is the standard for human anatomy. Springfield's population is consistently 1 digit short. This is, within the logic of the radiation theory, a consistent phenotypic mutation across the entire population. Not a random variation, a systematic one. Something that affects everyone who lives in the exposure zone, manifesting in the same specific way in every individual. Polydactyly, the presence of extra digits, is a documented effect of certain environmental exposures, including radiation during fetal development. Oligodactyly, the absence of digits that would normally be present, can also result from developmental disruption during gestation. What the show depicts is not random, it is consistent. Everyone in Springfield has 4 fingers. Nobody who visits from outside does. The contamination is doing something during fetal development that produces this consistent deviation from normal anatomy across every individual born in or long resident in the town. The bulging eyes. Springfield residents have eyes that sit slightly too large and slightly too forward in their faces. Not dramatically abnormal, not in a way that registers as shocking within the show's visual vocabulary, but consistently present and consistently absent in outside visitors. The same systematic deviation from normal human proportion that characterizes the eyes of every Springfield resident. The skull geometries? Homer's head occupies a shape that has no real anatomical precedent. His cranium, his overbite, the specific wrongness of his proportional relationship between different facial regions, is not merely a stylistic exaggeration. It maps onto the kind of cranial deformation that can result from developmental abnormality, including abnormality produced by environmental exposure during gestation. And then there's the immune function question. Homer survives injuries that should kill him, not once or occasionally, routinely. The show depicts him absorbing damage at a rate and severity that no ordinary human being could survive. He falls from great heights. He's electrocuted. He's hit by vehicles. He's in explosions. He walks away from all of it. Not always immediately, sometimes with comedic injuries that resolve unrealistically quickly, but always intact and always functional within the episode's timeline. The radiation theory has an answer for this that sits alongside the coma theory's answer without necessarily contradicting it. If prolonged radiation exposure has altered Homer's cellular biology in the ways that the show implies across its run, then the specific alterations might include changes to his body's relationship with physical trauma, not enhanced healing in the conventional sense. Something more fundamental, a cellular resilience or regenerative capacity that exceeds what normal human biology provides. The same contamination that produced his cognitive limitations, the same environmental damage that reduced his IQ to 55 and made a crayon undetectable in his skull for decades, may have simultaneously produced in his body a physical toughness that operates independently of his cognitive function. The radiation giveth and the radiation taketh away. What it took from Homer's mind it may have given to his body. Consider the specific pattern of Homer's survival across the show's run. He doesn't heal quickly in the way that cartoon characters conventionally heal quickly. He sustains genuine damage that the show depicts with medical specificity, broken bones and lacerations and internal injuries, and then he survives that damage and recovers from it in ways that exceed what the damage should allow. It's not that the show pretends the damage didn't happen. It's that the damage doesn't accumulate into consequences the way it would in a normal biological system. That's what altered cellular biology would look like in practice. Not immunity to damage. Immunity to the permanent consequences of damage. A body that takes what's done to it and then, through some mechanism that the contamination produced, manages to process and compensate for trauma in ways that shouldn't be possible. Burns's body does this through external medical intervention. Homer's body, the theory suggests, may do it through internal mutation. The billionaire engineered his survival. The safety inspector's body engineered his survival without his knowledge or participation, as a side effect of the same contamination that made him incompetent to prevent it from happening to everyone else. And there's one more piece of the radiation theory that deserves extended examination: the memory question. Springfield's residents forget things at a rate that goes beyond normal forgetting. Catastrophic events that should reshape a community's relationship with itself are absent from the next episode without explanation. Crises that would permanently alter the social fabric of any real community disappear from the shared memory of the town within an episode cycle. The show treats this as an episodic storytelling convention, and it is. But the radiation theory overlays a different explanation. Chronic radiation exposure has well-documented neurological effects. Among them, in prolonged low-level exposure scenarios, are effects on memory formation and retention. The hippocampus, the brain region most centrally involved in forming new long-term memories, is particularly sensitive to radiation damage. If Springfield's population has been exposed to low-level radiation contamination for decades, if the water supply and the air and the soil have been continuously delivering this exposure into the brains of the town's residents, then the pattern of collective forgetting that characterizes Springfield becomes explicable not as a storytelling device alone, but as a neurological symptom. They forget catastrophes not because they choose to, not purely because the social contract demands it, but because their capacity for forming and retaining the kind of long-term memory that would allow them to connect current events to previous ones has been compromised by decades of exposure. The radiological damage that reduced Homer's IQ to 55 and made him unable to connect his employer's identity to his mother's exile is the same damage that makes Springfield's collective memory unreliable. The plant poisons the water. The water affects the brain. The brain can't hold the memory of what the plant has done, and so the plant keeps doing it because the people who should be stopping it can't remember why they should. Burns built the perfect closed loop, the factory that poisons the memory that would have stopped the factory. We talked about the beauty of the coma theory earlier in the night, the tender reading of it, the version where Homer's dream is a love letter and his coma is the only heaven he'd ever ask for. But the coma theory has a darker side that deserves its own consideration, because the same logic that produces the beautiful reading also produces something considerably less comfortable. If Homer has been in a coma since April of 1993, and if the show's subsequent episodes are dreams generated by his deteriorating brain, then several things follow that the tender reading tends to gloss over. The first is the question of what is actually happening in the real world while Homer dreams. The dream preserves his family exactly as he left them. Bart is 10, Lisa is 8, Maggie is 1. Marge is in her mid-30s. The house is the same. The routines are the same. Everything is frozen at the moment Homer last experienced it. In the real world, which the dream by definition cannot show us, 30-something years have passed. Bart is not 10 in the real world. Bart, in the real world, is past 40. He has lived through his teenage years and his 20s and his 30s without his father. He has had experiences and relationships and failures and whatever versions of success are available to a person who grew up the way Bart grew up, without Homer present for most of it. The person Bart became in the real world, without Homer there to shape that becoming in the ways Homer's presence would have shaped it, is someone the dream cannot show us and someone Homer will never know. Lisa is the same. Lisa in the real world is not 8, she is past 40. Whatever she became, whether the trajectory the dream maps out for her, brilliant and isolated and searching and principled, matches the person she actually became without Homer present, is unknowable from inside the dream. Her real life happened without her father. Whatever she accomplished or failed to accomplish, or chose or didn't choose, she did it in a world where Homer was in a hospital bed. Maggie has spoken. In the real world, Maggie learned to talk. She went through toddlerhood and childhood and adolescence and adulthood. She became a person with a full vocabulary and a life and a personality that the dream can only speculate at through the prism of Homer's deepest hopes for her. The Maggie in the dream, the silent, brilliant operator with the strategic patience and the extraordinary intelligence, may or may not bear any resemblance to the Maggie who actually grew up. And Marge. This is the most uncomfortable implication of the coma theory's darker reading. The dream shows Marge as patient and present and still choosing Homer every day, because Homer's dreaming mind needs that to be true. His love for Marge is the foundation of the dream. His fear of losing her was his deepest fear before the coma. The dream cannot afford to show him a version of Marge who eventually had to stop waiting, who at some point in the real 30-something years that have passed had to build a different kind of life because the life she had wasn't sustainable. But the real world doesn't negotiate with what the dream can afford. The real Marge has been waiting, or not waiting, for 30-something years. The dream shows her exactly as she was on the last morning Homer saw her, patient and present and choosing him. What the real Marge has chosen across 3 decades of real time is something the dream cannot know and cannot show. There's a version of the coma theory's beautiful reading in which Marge is still there, in which she visits every day, in which she still holds Homer's hand and talks to him and tells him about the children and believes that he can hear her, in which the love story the dream is built around is being mirrored in the real world by a woman who refuses to give up on a man who hasn't opened his eyes in 30 years. There's another version in which she had to, in which the children needed her to be present in ways that required her to close a door on something she wasn't ready to close, in which pragmatism eventually made a claim that love alone couldn't fully answer, in which a version of moving forward that still held Homer in her heart but couldn't organize her entire life around the absence of someone who might never come back was the only viable choice. The dream can't show Homer either version, because the dream is generated by a brain that hasn't received any real information from the outside world in decades. It works from the last thing Homer knew, the last morning, the last look at his family before the vending machine fell. And it builds from there. Endlessly. Faithfully. In love with the people it's trying to hold. There's also the question of what Homer's coma is doing to him physically. The show's dream, if it is a dream, is generated by a brain that lost 5% of its function before the coma even started, and that has been in an unconscious state for decades since. Human brains in persistent vegetative or comatose states undergo measurable structural changes over time. Neuronal connections that aren't being used change. The brain's capacity for generating the kind of complex, sustained narrative that the show depicts as Homer's dream would, in a real coma scenario, be expected to diminish over time. And this maps onto the show's timeline in a way that is genuinely unsettling once you notice it. The dream gets more surreal as time passes. The plots become more disconnected from ordinary human experience. The internal logic becomes less consistent. The show that began with grounded family drama becomes, over decades, something that bears less and less resemblance to how reality actually operates. The escalating impossibility of the stories, from Homer going to space to Homer meeting multiple presidents to Homer surviving increasingly spectacular physical catastrophes, follows a trajectory that matches what you'd expect from a brain generating increasingly degraded narrative as its capacity to sustain complex, coherent dreaming diminishes. The dream isn't getting more creative. The dream is getting worse. And somewhere, in a hospital room in Springfield, a man who loves his family more than anything else has ever loved anything is lying very still, holding on with everything he has left to the last images of the people he can't reach, running the simulation until it runs out. We've established that Burns knows about the radiation's effects on Springfield. The show makes this clear through the weekly treatment and the pharmaceutical division and the personal physicians. But the theory goes further than that, and following it to its end reveals something about the specific shape of Burns's control over Springfield that is more deliberate and more sustained than simple negligence. Burns knows what the plant is doing to the population. He knows it because he studies his own body's response to radiation management every week. He has been managing the effects of radiation on his own biological systems for decades, and the resources he dedicates to that management have given him a level of understanding about radiation's effects on human biology that no one else in Springfield has access to. He knows what it does to cognitive function. He knows what it does to developmental biology. He knows what happens to a population that drinks contaminated water and breathes contaminated air for extended periods. He knows, and he has chosen, across decades, to continue. The question is whether that choice is simply greed and self-interest, the simplest reading, or whether it's something more structured. Whether Burns's maintenance of the plant's contamination is purely about profit and the inconvenience of cleanup, or whether it reflects an understanding of what the contamination produces in the population and a calculation that what it produces is useful. Consider what the contamination produces. It produces a population with compromised critical thinking capacity, with unreliable memory formation, with reduced capacity to connect causes to effects across extended time periods, with the specific cognitive profile that makes them effective workers for Burns's operation and ineffective challengers to his authority. A population that can look at a three-eyed fish and not connect it to the plant. That can experience environmental catastrophe after environmental catastrophe and not sustain the memory required to organize around it. That can have their sons stolen and their schools defunded and their retirement homes destroyed and still show up for work the following Monday because the plant is the only employer in town, and challenging it requires a kind of sustained cognitive engagement that the contamination has made very difficult. Burns didn't design this. The contamination preceded any plan he might have had for it. The plant's violations existed before it was clear what the cumulative effect of those violations would be on a population exposed to them over decades. But at some point in the show's implied history, Burns had the resources and the intellectual capacity to understand what was happening to the town around his facility. And at that point, he made a choice. Not to clean it up. The choice might have been made purely for financial reasons. Remediation is expensive. The contamination was doing nothing visible that would trigger regulatory intervention his legal team couldn't manage. The decision to continue might have required no more sophisticated analysis than the observation that cleanup was costly and not cleaning up was not, in any immediate sense, costly. But the theory suggests that at some point in that calculation, Burns also noticed the side effects, the particular docility of the population, the specific ways in which chronic low-level radiation exposure produces a community that is very well suited to being managed by a single powerful economic actor, and that this observation became part of the calculation. Not the reason he didn't clean it up, but perhaps a reason he didn't feel urgency about cleaning it up. A silver lining that made the cost of remediation feel even less necessary than it would have felt on purely financial grounds. The show supports this reading through what it reveals about Homer's employment. Burns keeps Homer not just because Homer is incompetent enough to miss violations. He keeps Homer because Homer is the product of a specific kind of damage, both the radiation exposure and the maternal loss, and the crayon and the accumulated experience of growing up in Springfield. That makes him exactly the kind of employee Burns's operation requires. Someone who will endure any condition rather than risk losing what little stability he has. Someone who has been broken in precisely the ways that make him most useful. Burns didn't break Homer on purpose, at least not entirely. But he has maintained the conditions that keep Homer broken. And he has done so while knowing because he has the resources to know what those conditions are doing and what they produce. That's not negligence. That's management. Let's pull back from the individual theories for a moment and look at what all of them together are pointing at. The Simpsons is, at one level, a comedy about a family in a funny town. That level is real. The comedy is real. The laughs are real. The show has produced more moments of genuine, unforced humor across its run than almost any other program in television history. The craft that goes into an episode of The Simpsons at its best is extraordinary, and the best episodes of the series are among the finest examples of comedic storytelling in the medium's history. But underneath that level, underneath the comedy that operates on the surface, all of the theories we've explored tonight are pointing at something that the comedy covers and the theories expose. Springfield is America, not a satirical exaggeration of America, not a comedic distortion of America for the purpose of critique. Springfield is a map of what America actually is when you look at it from the specific angle that 36 years of sustained observational satire by a writing staff of exceptional intelligence has produced. The nuclear power plant that poisons the water while employing the town, represents the specific relationship between American industrial capitalism and the communities that host its infrastructure. The communities that need the jobs and need the economic activity and need the employer, and so cannot afford to examine too carefully what the cost of that dependence actually is. The American experience of living near something that is necessary and dangerous simultaneously, of drinking from a water supply you'd rather not examine, of accepting a specific kind of harm in exchange for a specific kind of stability, is everywhere in America. Springfield just draws it with more explicitness than most conversations about it allow. Burns represents American concentrated wealth at the scale where it stops being about money and becomes about power, about the capacity to shape the conditions of other people's lives without their meaningful input or consent, about the specific kind of longevity that comes not from personal virtue or health habits, but from the capacity to purchase the medical infrastructure required to sustain life beyond its natural limits. American wealth at its most extreme is not merely a financial condition. It is a structural position that provides access to forms of continuation that are simply unavailable to people who do not occupy that position. Burns lives forever because he can afford to. That's the whole truth of him. Homer represents what America does to the people who keep it running. The specific combination of genuine goodness, genuine limitation, and genuine damage that characterizes the working class in a country that has been systematically hollowing out the infrastructure of working-class life for decades. Homer is not stupid because he was born stupid. He is cognitively limited because he grew up in a contaminated environment, because his mother's absence shaped him in ways that made intellectual development harder, because a crayon in his brain went undetected in a healthcare system that serves people like Homer with the attention they can afford. He is limited by his circumstances in ways that his circumstances have also made it impossible for him to recognize. Marge represents the labor that sustains everything without being acknowledged as labor. The patient maintenance of family and household and emotional equilibrium that makes everything else possible and is consistently undervalued precisely because it is so consistently present. The person who keeps the structure standing is the last person anyone thinks to credit for the structure standing. Lisa represents the American experience of knowing things that your community doesn't want to hear and paying the social cost of knowing them. The experience of being right in a way that makes people around you uncomfortable and discovering that being right in the absence of social power accomplishes very little. Lisa knows. Lisa has always known, and her knowledge has never once produced the outcome her knowledge should produce, because knowledge without power is just a burden. Bart represents the only honest response left when the systems that are supposed to work don't work, when the institutions that are supposed to be accountable aren't, when the adults in the room have abdicated the responsibility they were given. Chaos as a rational strategy. Mischief as a form of protest by someone too young to have the vocabulary to name what they're protesting against. Bart disrupts because disruption is the only tool available to someone who doesn't have access to any other form of leverage. And Maggie. Maggie is the future that nobody is paying attention to. The version of what comes next that is forming itself in silence. Watching everything, absorbing everything, preparing for the moment when it will be capable of acting. Maggie is what America keeps not noticing because America is too busy watching Homer fall down. The future is always forming in the margins while the present is too loud and too chaotic to allow the margins any attention. Springfield is America. The show drew it in 1989 and has been redrawing it every week since. And the reason the theories are so compelling, the reason so many people across so many years have been so committed to finding the patterns and connecting the threads and understanding what Springfield actually is underneath the comedy, is that understanding Springfield is one of the available ways of understanding America, which is a thing Americans have always needed help doing, and which The Simpsons has always quietly been offering to provide, underneath the jokes, in the structure of the town and its inhabitants, and its impossible persistence. The town is us. The loop is ours. We built it, and we maintain it, and we tune in every week to confirm it's still there. And Springfield keeps running because we keep watching. And that's the whole mystery. Not the radiation or the coma or the conspiracy or the floating timeline. The mystery is us, watching, year after year, keeping the loop alive. Because as long as the loop is alive, we can go home. And the house will look exactly the way it always looked, and the family will be exactly as they always were, and nothing will have changed. Except us. We changed. While Springfield stayed the same. That's the real mystery. and it's the one that was never going to fit in a theory. It can only be felt. Let's spend some real time with that number. 342. That is the number of safety violations found when inspectors examined the Springfield nuclear power plant in a surprise audit. Not a handful, not a dozen, not even 100, which would itself be a number so large as to constitute a humanitarian crisis waiting to be classified. 342 documented failures. 342 specific, cataloged instances where the facility was not meeting the minimum standards required to prevent it from poisoning, irradiating, or outright killing the people who live around it. Think about what that means in practice. A safety violation at a nuclear facility is not a minor paperwork discrepancy. It is not a box left unchecked on a form that someone filed late. A safety violation at a nuclear power plant represents a specific gap between what the facility is doing and what the facility is required to do to avoid causing harm to human beings and their environment. Each violation in a facility of this type is a specific point of failure with specific potential consequences measured in human health, in water quality, in air safety, in the basic biological conditions required for the people living nearby to function as human beings, rather than as unwitting participants in an experiment they never consented to. 342 of those. The show reveals the estimated cost to bring the plant up to code as $56 million. Burns refused to spend it. He is a billionaire many times over. He has enough personal wealth to fund the plant's remediation dozens of times, without meaningful financial impact on his life. The $56 million was not a number that threatened him. It was not a number that required sacrifice or difficulty or any meaningful adjustment to his circumstances. It was simply money, a category of thing he has in quantities that exceed any reasonable person's capacity to spend it, and he chose not to deploy it toward the purpose of not poisoning his workforce and the people who live downwind. The choice Burns made was not a financial necessity. It was a preference. And the preference was informed by something that the radiation theory makes explicit. Cleaning up the plant would mean acknowledging that the plant was dirty. Acknowledging that the plant was dirty would create a record. A record would invite questions. Questions would require answers. Answers would lead to the next question, and eventually to the question that Burns has spent decades ensuring nobody asks loudly enough to matter, which is, if the fish have 3 eyes, what has 30 years of this done to the people? Burns has kept the violations in place not simply because remediation is expensive. He has kept them in place because the violations are the walls of a secret that is considerably more expensive than $56 million. What has been done to Springfield's water supply is not a line item on a balance sheet. What has been done to the cognitive function of every person who grew up drinking that water is not a liability Burns can pay off and walk away from clean. The violations stay because the alternative to the violations is accountability. And accountability, for a man who has spent over a century ensuring that no meaningful accountability can reach him, is genuinely more threatening than any financial penalty. Now think about Homer's role in all of this. Homer Simpson's job title is Safety Inspector. He is, by official designation, the person at the Springfield nuclear power plant whose specific professional responsibility is to identify safety issues and address them before they become crises. He is the mechanism through which the facility is supposed to be protected from becoming what it has already been in every meaningful sense for the entirety of his employment. And Homer has an IQ of 55. He sleeps at his workstation. He eats donuts during meltdown warnings. He once attempted to use plutonium as a paperweight, and at another point threw a donut into the reactor core on the grounds that he was curious whether it would grow. He is, by any functional assessment, not merely unqualified for the role he occupies, but positively dangerous to the purpose that role is supposed to serve. The show frames this as a joke about incompetent employment, and it is funny. The contrast between the gravity of the responsibility and the specific person who holds it is one of the show's most durable comic premises. But the radiation theory reframes the joke as a design feature. When German investors briefly took ownership of the plant, the first thing they did was fire Homer. Not eventually, not after a trial period, not with the kind of institutional hesitation that surrounds letting someone go who has been at a place for a long time. Immediately. They evaluated the plant's operation, and the first personnel decision they made was to remove the person who was theoretically responsible for safety. Because a competent safety inspector would have documented the violations, would have escalated them to regulatory bodies, would have made the case that could not be made without creating the record that Burns spent decades ensuring did not exist. And when Burns bought the plant back, the first thing he did was rehire Homer. Not because Homer's absence had been felt in any operational sense. Not because Homer had been performing his role effectively and his removal had caused problems. Because a competent safety inspector is a threat to the plant's continued operation in its current, violation-laden, contaminating state. And Homer Simpson is the exact opposite of a threat to that. Homer is the shield. Not a passive shield, not simply an incompetent person who ended up in the wrong place, but an active instrument of continued non-accountability. His presence in the safety inspector's role is the institutional mechanism by which Burns ensures that the 342 violations stay undocumented, unaddressed, and unknown to anyone with the authority to do something about them. Homer doesn't protect Springfield from the plant. Homer protects the plant from Springfield. And the thing that makes this genuinely dark rather than simply cynical is that Homer doesn't know. His inability to see what his role actually is, his genuine belief that he's doing a job in something like the way he understands jobs to work, is not a performance. It's the outcome of the same damage that makes him useful. Burns doesn't need Homer to understand what he's doing. He needs Homer to keep doing it. And the same contamination that produced Homer's cognitive limitations ensures that Homer will keep doing it without ever developing the capacity to understand why. Lisa Simpson has known about the plant for years. She has known about Burns for years. She has the intellectual capacity to trace every thread we've been tracing tonight, to connect the radiation to the cognitive damage to her father's employment, to the three-eyed fish, to the violations to Burns's weekly treatments. She has the intelligence to see the whole picture, and she has never been able to do anything about it. This is perhaps the cruelest, sustained joke the show has been telling since the beginning. Lisa is the smartest person in Springfield. The show has established this repeatedly and without ambiguity. Her IQ has been measured at various points and has consistently placed her in ranges that qualify as exceptional by any standard. She has demonstrated intellectual capacities that exceed those of adults many times her age. She reads widely and thinks carefully and synthesizes information in ways that her family and her community cannot match. And none of it has changed anything. She lives in a contaminated town and knows it's contaminated and can't stop it. She knows her father works for a man who is, in some meaningful sense, responsible for the damage done to her family across generations, and she can't change that either. She can see the three-eyed fish and understand what it means and ask the questions it raises and get nowhere with the answers. She can see Burns stealing the sun, which is a level of corporate villainy so obvious and so enormous that it should require no intellectual sophistication to oppose, and the most she can do is participate in a community meeting that resolves nothing. Lisa's intelligence, in Springfield, is entirely disconnected from power, and the show is very deliberate about this. It's not that Lisa fails because she's unlucky or because she hasn't found the right approach. She fails because the structure of Springfield is specifically designed to prevent the kind of intervention that her intelligence would naturally move toward. The town's economy is dependent on the plant. The plant's continued operation requires the violations. The violations require Homer. Homer requires the deal between Burns and Grandpa. The deal requires Grandpa's silence. All of these things are interconnected in ways that make it impossible to pull on any individual thread without the entire structure resisting. Lisa can see the structure. What she can't find is a place to stand outside of it from which to exert enough force to change it. And so she keeps doing what she does, asking the questions, getting frustrated, getting dismissed. Going back to her saxophone and playing the blues in a town that created the conditions for the blues while maintaining the convenient fiction that everything is basically fine. The saxophone is not incidental. The show chose that instrument specifically and it has kept it consistently. The saxophone is the instrument of a particular American musical tradition, one that emerged from a particular American experience of suffering and endurance and making something beautiful out of circumstances that don't deserve beauty. Lisa plays the saxophone because she is Springfield's blues singer, because she sees what's there to see and she knows that seeing it doesn't change it, and she makes music out of the gap between what she knows and what she can do about it. That's not just a character detail. That's the show's thesis about what intelligence accomplishes in an environment structured to neutralize it. The Principal and the Pauper is the episode fans have been arguing about for almost 30 years. But the argument has always been about the wrong thing. Fans argued about whether the episode destroyed Skinner's character, whether the retcon was too jarring, whether the writers had broken faith with the audience by invalidating decades of character development. These are all real concerns and they're not entirely wrong. But the argument missed what the episode was actually doing. It was showing you the mechanism, Springfield's collective amnesia, its ability to forget catastrophes and contradictions and uncomfortable truths, and simply reset to a version of normal that requires those things not to have happened, has always been one of the show's most discussed features. How does the town just forget? How does Homer cause a nuclear near-miss in one episode and nobody ever mentions it again? How does Springfield get sealed under a dome by the federal government and then, in subsequent episodes, not be under a dome? How does the town collectively experience disasters that would fundamentally reshape any real community's sense of itself and then just continue as if none of it happened? The Principal and the Pauper showed you the how. It showed you a room full of people who were given definitive proof that their reality was built on a false foundation, who were shown in the most direct possible terms that the person they thought they knew was not who they thought he was, and who then voted, deliberately and unanimously, to ignore the proof, to declare the lie legally true, to exile the truth, along with the person who embodied it. And then it showed you the mechanism by which that vote was enforced, the judge's decree, the legal prohibition on discussing what they all knew to be real, the physical removal of the inconvenient witness from the community's space. This is not an isolated event in Springfield's history. It is the recurring process by which Springfield manages its relationship with reality. The votes are usually invisible. The decrees are usually unspoken. The exiling of uncomfortable truths is usually accomplished through social pressure and collective silence, rather than through an explicitly articulated legal judgment. But the process is the same. Springfield sees the thing it cannot afford to see, and then Springfield decides not to see it, and then Springfield makes it very difficult for anyone who continues seeing it to remain in Springfield. The real Seymour Skinner was the most recent visible manifestation of this process. But he wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. Every time Springfield has a three-eyed fish moment and doesn't follow through on what the three-eyed fish means, the same process is occurring. Every time a catastrophe is absorbed and forgotten, the same vote is being taken. Every time someone in Springfield almost sees what's really happening and then doesn't, the decree is being honored. Springfield doesn't forget accidentally. Springfield forgets as an act of communal will. And the reason is always the same. Remembering is more expensive than forgetting. Following the truth wherever it leads means following it to the plant. And the plant is the economy, and the economy is the town, and the town is everything everyone in Springfield has. You can't dismantle the thing everyone is dependent on without dismantling the dependency itself. And dismantling the dependency would require an act of collective courage that the radiation and the economic pressure and the specific social contract that the Principal and the Pauper made visible have all combined to make very nearly impossible. So they forget. They take the vote that's never called. They honor the decree that's never issued. They send the truth away on the train that's never shown departing. And Springfield continues. And the plant continues. And Burns continues. And Homer goes to work on Monday. And the fish still has three eyes and nobody asks why. We talked about Maggie's silence as strategy, as the smartest possible response to the environment she was born into, as the lesson learned from watching what happened to Lisa every time Lisa decided to be visible about what she knew. But let's think about what that strategy costs. Being the most capable person in your family and choosing to be invisible about it is not a neutral position. It is not simply a clever tactic that produces maximum effectiveness at minimum cost. It is a sustained act of self-concealment that has real consequences for the person performing it. Maggie has never been seen. Not truly. Not in the way that a person needs to be seen to feel like themselves, rather than like a performance of themselves for a specific strategic purpose. She is seen as a baby. She is seen as the quiet one. She is seen as the child who doesn't talk yet, who hasn't developed yet, who will presumably develop in time and then become someone. But she is never seen as what she is, which is a mind of exceptional capacity operating in a body that can barely keep up with it, watching everything and understanding everything and waiting. The waiting is the part that deserves more attention than it gets. What is Maggie waiting for? The show doesn't answer this. It never has. Maggie's endgame is the most genuinely open question in the show's canon. Every other main character has a clear trajectory, however frozen in place that trajectory might be. Homer wants to be loved and wants his family to be okay. Marge wants the family to stay together and wants some acknowledgement of the work she does. Bart wants freedom and attention and the satisfaction of disrupting systems that he senses are wrong without being able to name why. Lisa wants the world to be better and wants to be recognized as someone who can help make it so. Maggie wants something. She is demonstrably capable of acting in pursuit of what she wants, having demonstrated this capacity in the daycare rebellion and in the shooting of Burns and in the longest daycare short. She has the intelligence to plan and the patience to wait and the situational awareness to act at exactly the right moment. She is not a passive character who things happen to. She is an active character who chooses not to make things happen until the conditions are right. So, what are the right conditions? What is she waiting for? The radiation theory offers one answer. Maggie is waiting until her body can support what her mind is already capable of. She is a mutation that went in the opposite direction from Homer, a mind amplified rather than diminished, and she is constrained by the physical reality of being 1 year old in a body that can barely walk without falling. The waiting isn't patience as a strategy. The waiting is the gap between what she can already think and what she can yet do. When her body catches up, when she is physically capable of the kind of action her intelligence has already mapped out, the waiting will end. The coma theory offers another answer. Maggie is waiting because Homer is waiting. She exists in his dream as the embodiment of his hope for her, the projection of a father's most generous estimation of his youngest child, and the dream has no mechanism for her to act fully. Because a dreaming mind doesn't know how the story ends for the child it can't watch grow up, Maggie is suspended in potential, because Homer is suspended in the hospital bed, and neither of them can move forward until the other does. But the simplest answer, the one the show keeps quietly suggesting without ever making explicit, is the most unsettling. Maggie is waiting for the moment when Springfield is ready for what she has to say. And Springfield hasn't been ready yet, has never been ready, has never created the conditions under which what Maggie knows and what Maggie is capable of could be received rather than dismissed. She saw what happened to Lisa. She knows what Springfield does with intelligence that announces itself. She knows what the town does with truth that makes itself inconvenient. She has watched, for 36 years, as the smartest visible person in the family has been consistently unable to move the needle on anything because the system is designed to absorb what Lisa does and continue unchanged. Maggie is not going to make that mistake. She is going to wait. She is going to keep watching. She is going to keep being the baby in the corner that nobody worries about. And somewhere in that silence, she is building something. What it is and when it arrives, the show has always declined to show us. But the fact that she keeps checking to make sure nobody is watching before she lets herself be seen says everything about how serious she is about the waiting. She is committed to the silence in a way that requires active maintenance. She has to choose it every day, against whatever impulse toward expression a mind like hers must generate constantly. And she does, every day, without complaint, without slipping, without accidentally being more than a baby in the corner. That kind of discipline, in a 1-year-old, is the most quietly terrifying thing in Springfield. There is a version of the Simpsons story that begins not with Homer, but with Mona, with a woman who had a husband and a son and a quiet life in a town that was already, in 1969, absorbing the first consequences of what the plant was doing to it, and who looked at the world outside her kitchen window and decided she could not remain inside it. The show gives Mona a political awakening that it depicts with characteristic comedic compression, a montage of 60s imagery, a group of activists with signs, a moment of recognition that something larger than her domestic life was making claims on her conscience, and then a decision to act, specific and concrete, targeting the biological weapons facility that Burns was operating in the same town where her son was learning to walk. Let's think about that for a moment. Burns owned a germ warfare laboratory in Springfield, in the same community where his nuclear power plant was already operating. He was manufacturing weaponized biological agents in a town that had families in it, children in it, people who were going about their lives with no knowledge that the man who owned the most visible business in town was also cooking diseases in a lab somewhere in the community. Mona knew, her group knew, and they acted. The action was, by the show's account, essentially successful. They destroyed the biological agent, they shut down whatever immediate threat the facility represented. The antibiotic bomb worked. The germs were eliminated. The mission accomplished what it set out to accomplish. And then Mona stopped to help someone who had fallen. And that someone was Burns. She stopped to help a man whose weapons she had just destroyed. That instinct, that reflex toward helping a person in difficulty even when the person is your enemy, and even when helping them creates risk for you, is the most important thing the show tells you about Mona. It tells you that her political radicalism wasn't driven by hatred. It wasn't motivated by the desire to harm anyone. It was driven by a moral framework that required her to act against systems and structures while remaining capable of caring for individual people, even when those people were embedded in the systems she was fighting. She helped Burns. Burns saw her face. Burns reported her. And Mona's life in Springfield ended that night. 27 years. That's how long Homer grew up believing his mother was dead. 27 years during which every psychological consequence of maternal loss shaped him into the person he became. The desperate need for approval, the terror of abandonment, the clinginess toward Marge that is, at its foundation, a man who lost his mother at 6 and has never fully trusted that the people he loves will stay. The willingness to endure almost anything from Burns rather than risk losing the employment that represents his one stable anchor. All of it traces back to one night. To a woman who stopped to help the wrong person, to a man who responded to being helped by destroying the life of the person who helped him. Burns's revenge against Mona is the most revealing thing the show tells us about who he is at his core. He didn't pursue her because she was a genuine threat to his ongoing operations. The biological facility was gone. Whatever plans he'd had for it were disrupted. He could have rebuilt, could have relocated, could have simply moved on from a setback that his wealth and connections were more than adequate to absorb. Instead, he hunted her. For 27 years, he maintained an active pursuit of a woman who had once destroyed his laboratory, and in doing so had embarrassed him. He kept the FBI's involvement current. He responded to her reappearance in Springfield in Season 7 with immediate action, spotting her through a cab window and calling the authorities before the day was out. He never stopped. The pursuit of Mona Simpson is not a business decision. It is a personal one. It is what Burns is underneath the strategic calculation and the elaborate systems of management and control. Underneath all of that is a man who cannot tolerate being challenged, and who will spend decades ensuring that anyone who challenges him pays the maximum possible price. And the maximum possible price for Mona was not legal. It was not imprisonment. It was something Burns understood was more damaging than any legal consequence he could have sought. It was her son, her family, the life she had left behind on the night she had to run, keeping her from that life, keeping her a fugitive for 27 years, ensuring that she could not come home to the boy who woke up one morning and found her gone and never understood why, was the punishment. Not the FBI. The FBI was the mechanism. The punishment was the 30 years of Homer not knowing his mother and becoming the specific kind of person that not knowing her made him. Burns got exactly what he wanted. A broken Homer in Sector 7G, compliant and grateful, and incapable of seeing the connection between the man who signs his checks and the man who stole his childhood. And the worst part of it, the part that stays with you after you close the theory down and try to watch the show just as a comedy again, is that Homer forgave him. Not explicitly, not in a scene where Burns acknowledged what he'd done, and Homer chose to let it go. Homer forgave Burns without ever knowing there was anything to forgive. Because the damage was thorough enough that Homer couldn't make the connection even when all the information was available to him. That's not forgiveness. That's something worse than unforgiveness. It's the permanent inability to even formulate the grievance. We talked about how the Simpsons' predictions are best explained through volume, confirmation bias, and the show's habit of extrapolating visible trends to their logical endpoints. All of that is true, and all of that is the correct analytical frame for understanding the phenomenon at scale. But there are specific predictions that resist that frame, and it's worth sitting with them individually, not because they require a supernatural explanation, but because understanding why they feel different from the statistical average tells you something about the quality of observation that the show's writing staff has sustained across decades. The Trump prediction is the most famous, so let's start there. The show depicted a Trump presidency in the year 2016 years before it happened. The standard explanation is that Trump had been publicly discussing political ambition since the late 80s, and the show simply extrapolated a visible trend. This is correct as far as it goes. The trend was visible. The extrapolation was logical. A writing room full of intelligent observers of American culture, equipped with Harvard degrees and political science backgrounds, Making a joke about the most obvious possible endpoint of celebrity culture's colonization of political life is not prophecy, it's observation. But the specific detail of the escalator descent, the visual of Trump coming down an escalator to announce his candidacy, which the show's 2015 version mirrored almost exactly, is harder to explain purely through trend extrapolation. That specific staging choice, that particular way of entering a space for a political moment, is not something that follows obviously from the general observation that celebrity politicians tend toward spectacle. It's a specific image that the show produced and reality reproduced with a specificity that goes beyond the general. The most plausible explanation for the escalator detail specifically is not prediction, but cultural influence. The show put that image into the cultural bloodstream. When Trump's team was staging the announcement, consciously or unconsciously, the image existed in the culture as a reference. The show didn't predict the escalator. The escalator happened in a culture that had already seen the escalator in a show that millions of people watched. But then there is the Roy Horn tiger attack. Siegfried and Roy were a famous Las Vegas act. They worked with large cats, primarily white tigers. The show depicted, in an episode about a Siegfried and Roy analog act, a white tiger attacking one of the performers. This happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's white tigers during a live performance. This one is harder to explain through the standard framework. Siegfried and Roy were not known for their dangerous act in the way that, say, a daredevil or a stunt performer might be. Their performances emphasize the magic and the relationship between the performers and the animals, not the danger of working with large predators. The show making a joke specifically about a white tiger attacking one of the performers requires either an observation about the underlying risks of their work that wasn't part of the general public discourse about them, or genuine coincidence at a level of specificity that makes the word coincidence feel inadequate. The Higgs boson equation that Homer writes on a chalkboard in 1998, which a physicist named Simon Singh identified in 2015 as containing a formula that predicts the mass of the Higgs boson, is perhaps the strangest of all the predictions. The episode was written in 1998. The Higgs boson was theoretically predicted, but not experimentally confirmed until 2012. The show had at least one writer with a mathematics background who has stated that the equation on the chalkboard was written with some mathematical intention rather than as pure visual noise. But whether that intention extended to the specific prediction that Singh identified is something no one has been able to definitively establish. What all of these specific cases share, beyond the general framework of volume and confirmation bias, is an apparent precision that distinguishes them from the bulk of the show's satirical observations. Most of the show's forward-looking content is directional, rather than specific. It observes that technology will become more personal, and imagines a wrist-mounted device. It observes that media companies will consolidate, and imagines a mega-corporation absorbing its competitors. These are observations about direction, about where visible trends are pointing. The specific predictions, the ones that feel genuinely unsettling even to the show's own creators, are precise in a way that directional extrapolation doesn't fully account for. They are specific images, specific details, specific configurations of events that match reality not just in their general direction but in their particular form. The most honest thing to say about them is that they represent the outer edge of what sustained, intelligent, voluminous observation of American culture produces over a long enough period. Not prophecy, not conspiracy, but something that sits at the boundary of what analysis and observation can reach, where the observation is so precise and the volume so large that occasionally, in ways that feel impossible but aren't, the specific future gets glimpsed in the specific present. The show's writers are very good at their jobs. The best of them have been very good at their jobs for a very long time. And what very good observers produce, over a long enough period, occasionally looks indistinguishable from clairvoyance, even when it's only the highest expression of human pattern recognition. That's the honest answer to the predictions. It doesn't fully explain the escalator. It doesn't fully explain the tiger. It doesn't explain the Higgs boson formula to anyone's complete satisfaction. But it gets closer than any other explanation available. We covered the geographic impossibility of Springfield's location earlier, the way it borders Ohio and Nevada and Maine and Kentucky depending on which episode you're watching, the way it has mountains and oceans and deserts within driving distance of each other, The way its area code suggests Missouri, while its climate suggests everything and its topography suggests everywhere simultaneously, but there's a dimension of the geography question that connects more directly to the other theories and deserves its own exploration. The question isn't just where Springfield is. The question is why the show has gone to such lengths for so many years to ensure that the answer remains unknowable. Think about the effort required to sustain the geographic ambiguity for 36 years. Every episode that touches on location has to thread a needle, providing enough local color to feel grounded while avoiding any specific detail that would resolve the question. Every writer who has joined the staff has had to be briefed on the policy. Springfield is nowhere specific. Every time a clue appears that seems to narrow things down, another clue appears in a different episode that contradicts it. This is not an accidental accumulation of inconsistencies. It is a sustained creative commitment to a specific kind of geographic unlocatability. Why bother? The official answer is the one Groening gave. Springfield is meant to feel like every American town, universally relatable rather than specifically located, a setting that belongs to all viewers rather than to a particular regional audience. This is true, and it is the primary functional reason for the choice. But the functional reason coexists with another dimension that the theories make visible. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory jurisdiction. This is not a trivial detail for a community that operates under the shadow of a nuclear power plant with 342 violations, a billionaire who has evaded accountability for over a century, and a healthcare system that apparently failed to notice a crayon in a child's brain across decades of routine medical visits. Regulatory jurisdiction in the United States is geographic. The Environmental Protection Agency's authority over a specific facility is mediated through a specific state's environmental laws and a specific regional office's oversight capacity. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's authority over a specific plant depends on the plant being in a specific location, subject to specific oversight structures. A community that wants to challenge the practices of a facility in its midst needs to know which state's attorney general to contact, which regional EPA office to file with, which specific set of regulations applies to the specific place where the facility is operating. Springfield can't be challenged this way because Springfield can't be precisely located. The regulatory frameworks that should be reaching it are unable to attach because there's nowhere specific for them to attach to. The jurisdiction floats with the geography, always available in principle, never applicable in practice. This may be a joke. It probably is, primarily. But it is a joke that operates as a genuine shield. A town that can't be found on a map can't be investigated by the agencies that are supposed to investigate towns like it. The three-eyed fish can't be used as evidence in a case against the plant if the case has no venue because the plant has no fixed legal address. Springfield's geographic impossibility is its best legal defense. And Burns, who has spent over a century ensuring that no legal accountability can reach him, has built his most important facility in the one place in America that regulatory frameworks structurally cannot find. Not by accident. Hans Moleman dies constantly. He has been dying constantly for 36 years. And then he comes back. And then he dies again. The cycle has no apparent endpoint and no apparent mechanism. He simply dies, and then he doesn't, and then he dies again. We talked about the radiation theory's explanation, the mutation that produces a biological reset capacity. We talked about the coma theory's explanation, a background character that Homer's dreaming brain occasionally lets lapse. We talked about the collective denial theory's explanation, a town that has agreed not to notice that one of its members keeps dying. But there's a fourth explanation for Moleman that none of those frameworks quite reaches, and it comes from sitting with the one piece of canonical information the show gives us about him that doesn't fit any normal reading of his character. He is 31 years old. He looks 80 or 90. He is small and hunched and nearly blind, and moves through Springfield like a man whose body has been continuously failing him for decades. He has the physical profile of someone in the final stages of a very long life. And the show tells us, in his own words on camera, that he is 31. If he's telling the truth, and there is no canonical reason to believe he isn't, then something happened to Hans Moleman that aged him catastrophically. Something took a young man and compressed what should have been 60 years of physical aging into a fraction of that time. Something that also apparently gave him the biological resilience to survive repeated fatal events and keep showing up. The radiation theory has the most direct answer. Certain forms of radiation exposure produce accelerated aging as a documented biological effect. The mechanisms are related to oxidative stress and DNA damage, and the specific ways that radiation interferes with cellular repair processes. If Hans Mollmann received a particularly concentrated or particularly sustained exposure to the contamination that the plant has been dispersing into Springfield's environment, the result could be accelerated aging that compressed decades of biological wear into years. He looks 90 because his cellular biology has experienced something like 90 years of damage in 31 years of actual time. But if that's true, then Mollmann's repeated returns from death become even stranger. The same contamination that aged him catastrophically also gave him the same biological reset capacity that the radiation theory suggests Homer possesses, but in a more extreme form. Because Mollmann actually dies, he doesn't just survive serious damage the way Homer does. He ceases to function entirely and then resumes functioning, which means whatever the contamination did to his cellular biology went further than it went with Homer, reaching into territory that involves some mechanism for reconstitution after complete biological failure. This is deeply strange even within the logic of the radiation theory. And the strangeness is worth sitting with because it suggests that the contamination's effects are not uniform. They don't produce the same results in every person they touch. They produce a range of outcomes, some of which look like Homer's cognitive damage and physical resilience, some of which look like Mollmann's accelerated aging and apparent biological immortality, some of which presumably produce effects the show hasn't yet shown us, or has shown us without framing them as radiation effects. Springfield is a laboratory in which the contamination has been running a long-term experiment across a diverse population. The results of that experiment are all around us in every episode. We've just been too accustomed to the visual vocabulary of the show to see them as results rather than as character design choices. Mollmann is one of the most extreme data points in the experiment. The radiation took 31 years of him and made him look ancient, and then gave him something that prevents him from staying dead. What it took and what it gave are both visible in every scene he's in. And nobody in Springfield asks why. Because the question of why Hans Mollmann looks 90 at 31 is the same question as why the fish have 3 eyes. And Springfield has been answering that question the same way since season 2, by not answering it. The most theologically disturbing detail in the entire Simpsons canon is not Burns's near immortality or Homer's survival of injuries that should kill him, or the fact that a town keeps forgetting catastrophes that should define it. It's this: God talks to Homer, not metaphorically, not through signs or feelings or the ambiguous promptings of conscience that constitute most people's experience of religious communication. Face to face, voice to ear. God has appeared to Homer Simpson on multiple occasions and engaged him in actual conversation. Homer, the man with a crayon in his brain? Homer, the man with an IQ of 55? Homer, the man who sleeps during church, who pays attention to religious services only when they directly intersect with something he's personally interested in, who has described his relationship to faith with a casualness that borders on disrespect. This is the man God talks to. And then there is Ned. Ned Flanders, who attends church every Sunday without fail, who tithes, who prays, who has organized his entire life around a sincere and sustained faith that, by his own account, is the foundation of his capacity to endure what his life has required him to endure. Who has read the Bible and quotes it and lives by it, and who has, in the show's depiction, a religious commitment that is not performative but genuine, not social but personal. God has never talked to Ned. The show doesn't make a joke of this. It doesn't highlight it. It simply depicts it, consistently, across the show's run. Homer gets the divine conversations, Ned gets the silence. The man who has dedicated his life to faith gets nothing from the object of that faith. The man who has arguably done nothing to merit divine attention gets it repeatedly. This could be read as a joke about the arbitrary nature of grace, the theological concept that divine favor is not earned and cannot be predicted from human virtue, and that reading is not wrong. The show is aware of the theological framework it's playing in, but the theory takes it further, and the further reading is the one that stays with you. If the show is, as the radiation theory suggests, depicting a town where the rules of normal reality don't apply because the contamination has altered the basic conditions of life in Springfield, then the divine communication question fits into that framework in a specific way. What if the contamination has produced, as one of its unpredictable effects, a kind of permeability in certain individuals, a thinning of the boundary between ordinary experience and whatever lies on the other side of it? What if Homer's particular configuration of cognitive damage and biological mutation has produced in him a specific receptivity that his undamaged brain would not have had? Burns's radiation made Homer less of a normal human being. Less cognitively, certainly, but less in other ways too, in ways that are harder to categorize. And what if one of those ways is a reduced resistance to the kind of contact that constitutes the divine communication the show depicts? Ned, who is cognitively intact and emotionally regulated, and whose brain functions as a normal brain functions, has a full set of the defenses that normal human consciousness maintains against experiences that fall outside of ordinary sensory reality. Homer, whose brain has been altered in ways that nobody fully understands, may not have those defenses in the same configuration. He sees things Ned doesn't see. He experiences things Ned doesn't experience. Not because he's more spiritually evolved, because he's less defended. Because the crayon and the radiation and the decades of accumulated damage have opened gaps in his consciousness through which things can enter that would normally be screened out. That's not a comfortable explanation. It's not a reassuring one. It suggests that Homer's divine communications are not a reward for virtue but a consequence of damage. That God talks to Homer not because Homer has earned it, but because Homer's damaged mind is accessible in ways that Ned's intact mind is not. And Ned, who has done everything right, who has maintained the intact and healthy and well-regulated consciousness that is supposed to be the goal, receives exactly what an intact consciousness designed to function in ordinary reality receives when it reaches towards something beyond ordinary reality. Silence. The system is not designed to reward goodness. The show says this loudly through Ned's story. It says it through the dead wife and the hurricane house and the institutionalization and the decades of being Homer's neighbor. The system rewards a specific kind of brokenness that happens to align with what the contamination produces. The contamination broke Homer in ways that, among other things, made him accessible to divine contact. The same contamination left Ned's mind intact, which means Ned has all of the standard defenses against extraordinary experience fully operational. He's too healthy to hear God. Homer is too damaged not to. That's not grace. That's not theology. That's the radiation making contact with something the show has always implied is real within its universe, and producing an outcome that is entirely consistent with the theory and entirely at odds with any conventional notion of how cosmic fairness is supposed to work. Which is, of course, completely consistent with Springfield. Let's try something. Let's imagine what it would feel like to be Bart Simpson. Not to observe Bart from the outside, not to analyze him as a character or a theory subject, but to actually try to inhabit the experience of being him. To think about what it would mean to exist the way he exists. Bart is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old for 36 years. He wakes up every morning in the same house, on the same street, in the same town, and goes through a day that is always different in its specific events and always the same in its fundamental nature. He is always in the 4th grade. He is always under the authority of Principal Skinner. He is always in Springfield Elementary with Mrs. Krabappel, who has since died in the real world but exists in the dream, or the loop, or whatever Springfield is, still waiting for him with a cigarette and a weary expression. He is always 10. The floating timeline tells us this is a narrative convenience, a production choice, the standard approach to long-running animation. And that's what it is at the level of production. But at the level of the show's own internal reality, Bart exists in a state that has no good analogy in human experience. He is not aging. He is not developing. The boy who pranked Homer with the beer can and put him in the coma, if the coma theory is right, has existed in exactly that configuration of personality and capacity and relationship ever since. For 36 years of real time. What does Bart know? He knows he's in the 4th grade. He knows he's 10. He knows his address and his family and his enemies and his few real friends. He knows Springfield with the intimate knowledge of a child who has spent his entire conscious existence in one place. Does he know that he's been 10 for 36 years? This is the question that the floating timeline doesn't have a comfortable answer to. Within the show's logic, the characters don't experience the passage of the real time that's passing outside the show's frame. They exist in the present of whatever episode is playing. They don't have a memory of previous seasons the way the audience does. They're not accumulating the experience of being in the same place for 36 years. They're just there. always, in the present. But the coma theory introduces a different consideration. If the show's events since 1993 are Homer's dream, then Bart exists in the dream as Homer's memory of him. And Homer's memory of Bart is frozen at the age Bart was when Homer last saw him clearly before the vending machine fell. Bart has been 10 in Homer's dream because Bart was 10 when Homer's conscious experience of Bart stopped. The dream can't age Bart because aging Bart would require information Homer doesn't have. He doesn't know what a 12-year-old Bart looks like. He doesn't know what Bart was like at 15 or 25 or 38. He only knows the 10-year-old. So in the dream, Bart stays 10. Not because Homer wants to keep him young, though maybe he does, because Homer's unconscious mind is working from the only material available to it, the last image of his son, preserved in the last moment before the vending machine fell, and everything that followed became unreachable. There's something devastating about this when you follow it fully. Homer's dream Bart does all the things the show's Bart does. He's mischievous and brave and occasionally tender. He pulls pranks and gets in trouble and has the moments of unexpected depth that characterize the character at his best. He's a complete person, fully rendered, apparently alive in every scene. But he's a memory. He's Homer's memory of his 10-year-old son, running on autopilot in a dreaming brain, doing the things the memory says Bart does, without the capacity to be anything beyond what Homer knew him to be at the moment the loop closed. And the real Bart, somewhere outside the hospital room, has grown up, has lived through all the years the dream is replaying, has become someone Homer doesn't know and can't know from inside the coma. The show has occasionally glimpsed futures for Bart, episodes that flash forward and show him as an adult, and what those futures consistently show is someone who is troubled, who has struggled, who has not had an easy time of becoming whoever he became. The future Barts the show depicts are not happy men. They are men who carry the weight of the childhood the show depicts, the pranks and the failures and the sense of being not quite enough at the things that matter, into an adult life that the childhood didn't well prepare them for. If those glimpses are in any sense accurate to the real Bart growing up outside the dream, then Homer's unconscious has, in its deepest processing, some awareness of what his absence has cost his son. The future Barts are not flourishing, they are managing. And the dream, which shows you a Bart who is vital and mischievous and alive in a 10-year-old's way, is perhaps Homer's refusal to see the adult his son became in the years Homer wasn't there to help shape him. The dream keeps Bart 10 because the 10-year-old is the Bart Homer loves most clearly, and because growing up means becoming someone different. And the dream can't afford Bart to become someone different, because different means time past, and time past means Homer is further from the last day he knew his family, and further from that day means closer to the question of whether there is anything left to return to. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves fuller treatment because the deal between Abraham Simpson and Mr. Burns is one of the most structurally important revelations in the show's canon, and its implications extend further than the surface reading allows. The deal is this. At some point in Springfield's history, Grandpa Simpson discovered that Burns had committed a crime. The specifics vary by episode and by reading, but the basic structure is consistent. Grandpa had information that could have been used against Burns. Information that, if properly deployed, could have created accountability for a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding it. And Grandpa made a deal. In exchange for his silence, Burns guaranteed Homer a job at the plant, permanent employment, immunity from firing regardless of performance, a guarantee that no matter how many violations Homer missed, and no matter how many documented errors accumulated in his file, the employment would continue. Think about what Grandpa sold. He sold his silence on Burns's crime. He sold the opportunity to hold the most powerful man in Springfield accountable for something Burns had actually done. He sold whatever possibility existed, however small, of genuine accountability being applied to a man who had never faced it. And in exchange, he got his son a job. Not wealth, not safety, not anything that would meaningfully improve the family's circumstances relative to where they were. A job. At the plant owned by the man whose crime Grandpa was agreeing to cover up, Homer would go to work every day for the man his father had protected from accountability, earning a salary from the institution whose continued unaccountability his father had personally guaranteed. The deal is a tragedy in miniature. Grandpa made the most pragmatic choice available to him, the one that secured something concrete for his family from a position of zero leverage. He couldn't have used the information in a way that would have meaningfully threatened Burns. He didn't have the resources or the connections or the legal infrastructure to turn what he knew into a genuine challenge to Burns's power. What he had was information that Burns wanted suppressed, and he traded it for the only thing he could realistically get. But what he traded it for was Homer's imprisonment. Because Homer's job at the plant is not just employment, it's the anchor that keeps Homer in Springfield. It's the stability that Homer's damaged psychology has organized itself around. It's the thing that Homer cannot afford to lose because losing it means losing the only stable structure in a life that has been systematically destabilized since the night his mother disappeared. Homer stays at the plant not because it's a good job, or because Burns is a good employer, or because the work is meaningful. Homer stays because Grandpa's deal made the plant Homer's anchor, and Homer's psychology made the anchor non-negotiable. And the deal's implications extend into the next generation too. Because Homer's children grow up with a father who works at the plant, who is employed by Burns, who is, in ways none of them fully understand, entangled with the man who is responsible for the condition their family is in. They grow up inside the system that the deal helped create and maintain. Lisa grows up in a contaminated town and knows it. Bart grows up as the child of a man whose full human potential has been systematically suppressed. Maggie grows up watching all of this and deciding, with whatever extraordinary cognitive machinery she possesses, that the silence is the only viable response to a structure this thoroughly constructed to contain everyone inside it. 3 generations. Grandpa made the deal. Homer paid for it. The children are still paying. And Burns won every step of the way. Because Burns understood something that Grandpa didn't, something that the deal revealed and that the deal's consequences have spent 3 generations demonstrating. The value of what Grandpa had wasn't in what it could have done to Burns. It was in what not using it would do to Homer. The cover-up wasn't just about protecting Burns from accountability. It was about creating the specific conditions that would produce Homer, the Homer that Burns needed. The man in Sector 7G who would never be capable of seeing what his life actually is. Grandpa thought he was getting Homer security. Burns knew he was getting Homer. Let's be honest about something. The Simpsons has been on the air for 36 years. It shows no sign of ending. The ratings that would have canceled most shows decades ago haven't been sufficient to cancel this one, because The Simpsons is not primarily a show anymore. It is an institution, a cultural landmark, a piece of American life that has been continuous for longer than most of its current audience has been alive. And the question that the floating timeline theory eventually forces you to ask is not what happens in Springfield when time stops. It's what happens to us. Because we are aging. The audience is aging. The people who watched Bart fall off his skateboard in the opening credits in 1989 and laughed for the first time are in their 50s now. The people who were children when Who Shot Mr. Burns aired as a summer cliffhanger in 1995 are approaching 40. The show they grew up with, the show that shaped how they understood American family life and American corporate power and American small-town culture, is still on, still running. Still the same yellow family in the same yellow house, doing variations of the same things they've always done. The show didn't age with us. The show stayed. And what that creates is a strange doubling. The Simpsons we watch now is not the same show it was in 1992 or 1995 or 2001. It has changed in ways that are continuously debated and analyzed. But the characters haven't changed. The house hasn't changed. The essential relationships haven't changed. We walk into the same living room every week and find the same family on the same couch, and then we walk away from it and go back to our lives, which are not the same as they were when we started watching. The show is a fixed point. We are the moving thing. And the theories, all the theories we've been through tonight, are in some sense attempts to understand what it means to have a fixed point in your experience of time. What it means to have a reference that doesn't change while everything else does. Why we keep returning to it. What it provides that moving things can't provide. The answer the theories keep arriving at, through different paths and different evidence, is that Springfield provides the experience of permanence. The thing that ordinary life cannot offer, because ordinary life is defined by its impermanence. People age in ordinary life. Relationships change, houses get sold, children grow up, parents die. The world that existed when you were young becomes something else while you weren't looking. And you find yourself in a present that is continuous with the past, but no longer recognizable as the same place. Springfield doesn't do that. Springfield is always the same. And we keep coming back because permanence is the thing we want and cannot have. Because the family in the yellow house on Evergreen Terrace is still there when everything else has moved. Because Bart is still 10 and Lisa is still 8 and the couch is still the couch and the opening credits still play exactly as they played the first time you saw them. We press pause on Springfield and we call it watching television. But what we're really doing is going somewhere time doesn't move. Somewhere the people we first met are exactly as we first met them. Somewhere the past is still present and the future hasn't happened yet, and the house looks just like it looked in the memory we've been carrying since we were children. The loop isn't their prison. We talked about this. The loop is ours. We built the loop by needing it. We maintain it by watching it. We make it stronger every time we return to it, every time we quote a line from an episode that aired before half the current audience was born, every time we share a clip that connects a 1,997 joke to a 2024 headline and feel that particular pleasure of recognition that comes from knowing both ends of the reference. Springfield is the town that will always be there when we come back. No matter how much time passes in the real world, no matter how many of the fixed points in our own lives shift or disappear, Springfield will be there. Bart will be 10. Lisa will be playing her saxophone. Homer will be in Sector 7G. Burns will be alive, sustained by treatments and wealth and the particular immortality of having made himself too expensive for even death to claim. And we will sit down in front of it, wherever we are in our lives, and for half an hour the fixed point will hold. The loop will run. The family will be exactly as they always were. That's the mystery. That's the final one. Not the radiation, or the coma, or the shooting, or the immortality, or the geography, or the predictions. The mystery is why we need a fixed point so badly that we sustain a television show for 36 years to have one. What it says about the experience of moving through time, that the thing we reach for when we want to feel stable is a cartoon family in an impossible town that runs on corrupted nuclear power and collective denial, and the particular love of a man who may have been dreaming for 3 decades. We built Springfield, not the writers, not the animators, not Fox or the network or the production company. We built it by needing it, by tuning in, by refusing to let the loop break, by being the audience that couldn't stop watching, which is the only force powerful enough to keep a show on the air for 36 years. Every mystery we've explored tonight, every theory and every thread and every buried storyline and every impossible event, it all comes back to that, to us, to the fact that we are the ones pressing the button that keeps the simulation running. Homer dreams because we dream with him. Springfield resets because we need it to reset. The family stays frozen because we can't bear to watch them age. We are the reason nothing in Springfield changes. And maybe that's okay. Maybe fixed points are what keep us from spinning out entirely as we move through a world that doesn't offer many of them. Maybe what Springfield provides, what all the stories that sustain us provide, is a kind of anchor, something to return to, something that says, this existed and it still exists, and when you come back it will look exactly the way you left it. That's not a small thing. That's actually a very large thing dressed up as a cartoon. 36 seasons, 788 episodes, the longest-running animated series in the history of American television. Still running, still yellow, still on Evergreen Terrace. Still waiting, just like Homer, just like all of us. There is a specific quality to watching The Simpsons late at night that is different from watching it at any other time. It's not just the darkness outside the window or the stillness that comes when the rest of the household has gone to sleep. It's something about what the show does in those conditions. The way the familiar colors feel different when the room around you is dark. The way Homer's voice carries differently when the house is quiet. The way the laughter track, if you're watching an early season, feels like company in a way it doesn't when you're watching surrounded by other people. Late at night, The Simpsons stops being background entertainment and starts being something closer to company. Something you turn on not because you're actively choosing to watch television, but because the alternative is the silence, and the silence has a quality to it that requires something to fill it. And The Simpsons fills it well. It's warm in the way that only familiar things are warm. It has the comfort of a story you already know, playing out in the way you've watched it play out before, with the particular pleasure of recognizing what's coming before it arrives. That familiarity is doing something. It's not just comfort in the trivial sense, it's a form of continuity. When you put on an episode of The Simpsons late at night, you are re-entering a world that has existed for longer than most of your adult memories. A world that was there before many of the things that currently define your life existed. A world that will, in all probability, still be there after many of those things have changed. That's not a small thing to offer someone. The experience of continuity in a life that is continuously changing, and it connects, in a way that is genuinely interesting, to the Homer's coma theory. Because the coma theory says that Homer's dream is doing for Homer what the show does for us. It provides the experience of a world that doesn't change when everything outside of it does. It gives him his family, preserved exactly as they were at the last moment he knew them, running through variations of family life that are always different in their specific events and always the same in their essential nature. Homer's dream is the fixed point around which his unconscious mind organizes itself. And our experience of the show is the fixed point around which our long-term relationship with it organizes. We know where everything is in Springfield the way we know where everything is in a childhood home. The nuclear plant is to the north. The school is in the middle of town. Moe's is on the south side. The power plant looms over everything. The house on Evergreen Terrace has the same furniture in the same rooms. The couch is always the couch. We don't need to consciously locate these things when we watch the show. They're already located. They've been located in our understanding of the show's world for decades. And that internal map, that cognitive layout of a place that doesn't exist, is part of what makes The Simpsons feel like a fixed point rather than just a television program. We know Springfield? Not in the way you know a place you've been, in the way you know a place that has been described to you so thoroughly and so consistently and over such a long period of time that it has become as real, in some functional sense, as places you have actually visited. More real, in some cases, because Springfield has been described to you by the show across 36 years of watching, which is longer than many of the places you've actually been have been present in your memory. And this is the final theory, the one that doesn't require any narrative framework about radiation or comas or conspiracies, the one that is just about what the show is and what it does and why we can't stop watching. The Simpsons is a memory palace. Not a memory palace in the classical sense, the mnemonic technique of placing information in a imagined architectural space. A memory palace in a more fundamental sense. A shared space where things that would otherwise be subject to time and change are preserved against those forces by the act of returning to them. Every time someone watches The Simpsons, every time the opening credits play and the family races from their separate parts of Springfield to converge on the couch in the living room, the shared space is re-entered. The preservation is renewed. The things inside it, the family, the town, the relationships, the specific configuration of people and place that constitutes Springfield are confirmed to still be there. And they are. They always are. Because the show is always running. Because somewhere in the world, at any given moment, someone is watching The Simpsons. The loop is always in motion somewhere. The dream is always being dreamed. Homer is always stumbling through the door at the end of another day at the plant. Marge is always patient in the kitchen. Bart is always 10 and in some kind of trouble. Lisa is always 8 and reading something nobody else wants to read. Maggie is always watching, always silent, always waiting for the moment that the show has been withholding for 36 years. And we are always watching them. That's the last mystery. Not a mystery that requires solving, a mystery that requires sitting with. The question of why a cartoon family in an impossible yellow town is one of the most durable things in American cultural life, having outlasted trends and technologies and presidencies and a global pandemic, and every prediction that the show had finally run its course, the answer is the same as it's always been. Because we need them to be there. Because the house on Evergreen Terrace is one of the places we know. Because the family on the couch is one of the constants in a life that offers fewer constants than we would prefer. Because home, in some meaningful sense, is just a place that stays the same while you change, and Springfield has stayed the same. For 36 years and counting. While all of us have changed around it, while we got older and moved and lost people and found people and made decisions and unmade them and woke up in mornings that looked nothing like the mornings we expected and went to bed in nights that required something to fill the silence and put on The Simpsons and felt the yellow house glow in the dark of the room and came home. Springfield is not just the Simpson family. Springfield is a population of several hundred named characters who cycle through the show's 36-year run, appearing and disappearing and reappearing in ways that reflect the town's peculiar relationship with continuity. And some of these minor characters, the ones who exist in the margins of the show's main storylines, carry the biggest secrets in Springfield's canon. Let's start with Sideshow Bob. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. is the closest thing the show has to a recurring villain, and his sustained presence across the show's run has produced one of the more elaborate subplots in the show's history. Bob is a genius, a genuine, documented, highly credentialed genius who went to an elite university, plays the piano at a professional level, reads literature in multiple languages, and has dedicated a significant portion of his adult life to the murder of a 10-year-old boy. The sustained failure to murder Bart Simpson is the joke. Bob's elaborate plans, his theatrical declarations, his sheer frustrated intelligence deployed against an opponent who defeats him through luck and chaos rather than through any matching intellectual capacity, these are the comedy. It's a great joke. It has been a great joke for 30 years. But the theory sits underneath the joke and asks a different question. What does it mean for Springfield that a man of Bob's evident capability has found himself in this loop? That someone who could, by any reasonable assessment of his abilities and education, be doing essentially anything with his life, has organized his existence around a vendetta against a child? The radiation theory has an answer, not for Bob specifically, but for the general pattern of Springfield's population, finding itself in loops that don't make sense given the resources available to them. The cognitive damage the contamination produces doesn't manifest the same way in every person. In Homer, it's general across all cognitive functions, reducing them uniformly to a floor that precludes effective complex reasoning. In Sideshow Bob, the theory suggests, the contamination may have produced a more specific and more insidious effect. The preservation of general intelligence alongside the impairment of the specific judgment that would allow that intelligence to be deployed productively. Bob is smart enough to plan and execute elaborate schemes. He is not smart enough to stop. The part of his cognition that should tell him that Bart Simpson is not the appropriate organizing principle of an adult life with his capabilities has been compromised. Not the planning capacity, not the language capacity, not the musical or literary intelligence. The judgment that evaluates the plans in relation to the planner's own best interests. That specific function appears to be where Bob's particular version of the contamination has done its damage. And this is a more specific and more terrifying version of what the radiation theory describes than Homer provides. Because Homer's damage is visible and general. You can see what's wrong with Homer and understand that it affects everything he does. Bob's damage is invisible and specific. He appears by almost every measure to be functioning at a high level. And he is. He's just functioning at a high level while being incapable of applying that function to the most basic question of whether what he's doing makes any sense. Springfield has produced a lot of Sideshow Bobs, not people planning to murder children, but people of evident capability who have found themselves in loops, in repetitive patterns, in sustained commitments to courses of action that their own intelligence should be sufficient to identify as unproductive, and who cannot stop. The town is full of people who are smarter than what they're doing, and the radiation theory says this is not coincidence. It's the specific shape of the contamination's effects on a population it has been influencing for decades. The contamination doesn't make everyone uniformly stupid. It makes some people specifically unable to use their intelligence in their own best interest. And that specific incapacity is harder to see than Homer's general incapacity. It hides behind apparent functionality. It manifests as perseveration and poor judgment, and the inability to revise a plan that isn't working, all of which look, from the outside, like stubbornness or passion or commitment rather than damage. Bob has been chasing Bart for 30 years. In that time, he could have built something extraordinary with his evident capabilities. He's aware of this on some level. The show occasionally shows him glimpsing the alternative, the life he could have had, the person he could have been. And then the plan reasserts itself. The loop resumes. And Bob goes back to being the most comprehensively wasted potential in Springfield, which is an extremely competitive category. Then there is Apu Nahasapi Mapetalone, who has a PhD from Caltech and runs the Quick E-Mart. The gap between his credentials and his employment is a show-long joke that the show has always treated as a gag about the difficulties immigrants face in having foreign qualifications recognized, which is a real and serious issue and a legitimate comedic subject. But the gap is also, under the theories we've been discussing, another data point in the pattern of Springfield absorbing capable people into positions that don't match their capacity. Apu has a doctorate from one of the most selective scientific institutions in the world. He is, by any academic standard, more qualified than virtually anyone else in Springfield to do almost anything that requires sustained intellectual effort. He runs a convenience store. The radiation theory doesn't need to claim that the contamination directly caused Apu's employment situation. That situation has real-world explanations that don't require theoretical frameworks. But it does suggest that Springfield is a place that systematically fails to deploy the capabilities of the people who live in it at the level those capabilities would warrant. That the town's structure, whatever maintains that structure, consistently produces this outcome across a range of people from different backgrounds and with different reasons for being stuck. Apu is stuck in the quick E-Mart the same way Homer is stuck at the plant, and Bob is stuck in the loop, and Ned is stuck in the programming, and Lisa is stuck in the 8th grade not being heard. The specific reasons differ. The pattern is consistent. Springfield is a place where potential goes to run out. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that announces itself. Gradually, imperceptibly, in the cumulative daily experience of being in a place that doesn't provide the conditions under which potential can develop into something beyond what it already is. And that, finally, is the most honest thing the show has ever said about what the place it depicts actually is. Not a funny town full of eccentric characters. A place that grinds. That wears things down slowly. That takes what could be and, through the accumulation of small defeats and missed opportunities and closed doors and poisoned water and compromised cognition and collective denial and deals made in silence between grandfathers and billionaires, produces what is instead. What is Homer in Sector 7G. What is Bob chasing Bart for 30 years. What is Lisa playing saxophone to an empty room. What is Maggie waiting? What could be is everything the show keeps almost showing you before the episode ends and the reset begins. What could be is the version of Springfield where someone asks the right question about the three-eyed fish and keeps asking it until the answer changes something. What could be is the town without the plant, or the plant without the violations, or the violations without the cover-up, or the cover-up without the deal, or the deal without the crime. Pull any thread and the whole thing unravels into something that might have been, under different circumstances, an actual place rather than a containment zone. What could be is the family that Mona came home to, the childhood Homer could have had with her, the intelligence he might have developed without the crayon and the radiation, and the accumulated damage of growing up in a town that was already making the specific kind of person it needed him to become. What could be is 36 years of Springfield actually changing, actually responding to what happens in it, actually accumulating the consequences of its choices, and living with them, and adjusting and growing. Instead of resetting, every week, on the same couch, in the same house, forever. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the show that shows you what is while keeping you just close enough to what could be to feel the gap between them is doing exactly what it should do. Maybe the theories are not about solving Springfield, but about feeling Springfield in a way that the comedy alone doesn't quite allow. Maybe understanding why nothing changes is the only way to understand why everything matters. Even in a cartoon town that runs on corrupted power and collective forgetting and one man's determination to keep a certain kind of broken man in Sector 7G until the world ends. Even there, especially there, the family on the couch, the house on Evergreen Terrace, the town that doesn't appear on any map, still running, still dreaming, still ours. Good night.